A man who spent 15 years learning how to survive anything, war, loss, the kind of grief that hollows you out from the inside, is about to discover that the one thing he cannot protect his daughter from is love. He saw fear in a stranger's eyes across a crowded cafe, and without thinking, without hesitating, he stood up. That single moment will cost him everything he spent 4 years rebuilding, and give him everything he never allowed himself to want. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city and country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one is going to take a while, and it is absolutely worth it. The Copperfinch Café sat on the corner of Ardell Street and Route 9, sandwiched between a hardware store that had been closing for 3 years and a laundromat with a broken sign. It was not a beautiful building. The awning had faded from whatever color it used to be to the approximate shade of old mustard, and the wooden door stuck in its frame every time the temperature dropped below 40. But the coffee was strong, the booths were deep, and nobody looked at you twice if you sat there for 2 hours over a single cup. Graham Vossler had been coming here since he was 19 years old. He was 37 now, and the cafe looked exactly the same. So did the coffee. So did the door that stuck. He came in on Tuesday mornings because Tuesdays were slow at the garage. He would sit in the second booth from the window, not the window booth, because his back needed a wall behind it, old habit, old training, and he would drink his coffee and read whatever was on his phone and try very hard not to think about anything in particular. He was reasonably good at that most days. This particular Tuesday was October, the kind of October morning where the sky couldn't quite decide between gray and blue, and the air had a bite to it that made your eyes water the moment you stepped outside. Graham had dropped Maisie at school 40 minutes earlier, listened to her talk the entire drive about a kid named Devlin who had apparently eaten an entire glue stick on a dare, and sat in the pickup for a moment after she disappeared through the school doors just watching the space where she'd been. He did that sometimes. Watched the space. He ordered his coffee from Nina, who had been working the Tuesday morning shift since roughly the beginning of recorded history, and settled into his booth with his phone face down and his hands wrapped around the mug. The cafe had maybe a dozen other people in it. A couple of older guys at the counter. A woman with a stroller in the corner. A man in a suit reading something on a tablet and eating a muffin with the joyless efficiency of someone who had already given up on breakfast being enjoyable. Graham was halfway through his second cup when he noticed her. She was sitting 3 booths down, on his side of the room, close enough to the window that the gray October light fell across the right side of her face. Late 20s, maybe 30. Dark hair pulled back in a way that looked like it had started the morning neat and had been quietly coming undone ever since. She had a coffee in front of her and a notebook open on the table, and she was writing in it with a pen, not typing, which was unusual enough that Graham noticed it. She had on a gray sweater that looked like it belonged to someone larger, and her jacket was folded on the seat beside her. She was pretty. Graham registered that the same way you'd register weather, factually, without attaching anything to it. He wasn't in the market for noticing pretty women, hadn't been in a long time, and he had gotten quite good at filing away observations without letting them become anything more. What he also noticed, more slowly, was that she kept glancing at the door. Not the way people glance at a door when they're waiting for someone they want to see. Something tighter than that. Her hand moved across the notebook, but her eyes kept pulling left toward the entrance. And every time someone pushed through that sticky door, she went very still for just a second before going back to writing. Graham looked at her a moment longer. Then he looked back down at his phone. None of his business. He ordered a third cup because Nina refilled it before he could say no, and because the morning was cold and the garage would be cold, and there was no particular reason to hurry back to it. He had one car due in at 10, Hector Bunn's perpetually struggling Ford Ranger, and then the afternoon was open. The door pushed open at 8:43. Graham knew the exact time because he had just glanced at his phone to check whether Maisie's teacher had emailed about the permission slip he had almost certainly forgotten to sign. She had not emailed yet, which meant either the trip wasn't until next week or she was saving it for a more pointed moment. The man who came in was not the kind of man the Copperfinch Café usually attracted. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, though money had a way of making men of that age look both younger and harder at the same time, and this one had been well-funded for a long time. Dark coat, suit underneath. The kind of shoes you didn't wear in small towns unless you were making a point. His hair was going silver at the temples, and he carried himself the way men did when they'd spent years assuming that rooms rearranged themselves around their arrival. He scanned the cafe in about 3 seconds, found what he was looking for in 4. He moved toward the booths with the focused, unhurried confidence of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. Graham had been watching from the moment the door opened. I didn't know why. Old habit, maybe. Or the fact that the woman 3 booths down had gone completely rigid the moment she registered the footsteps. The man, Tristan, though Graham wouldn't know his name for another 20 minutes, stopped at her table. He looked down at her notebook, at her coffee cup. His expression wasn't angry exactly. It was the expression of someone who was used to inconveniences eventually correcting themselves. Elara. His voice was low, conversational, like they were picking up a discussion that had simply paused. This is a little far to drive for average coffee. The woman, Elara, closed her notebook. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. Graham recognized that kind of control. He had used it himself in situations where control was the only thing standing between you and a very bad outcome. I'm not going back with you, she said. Quiet, steady. But her left hand was flat on the table and pressing down slightly, and Graham could see from where he sat that it was not entirely steady. We've talked about this. Tristan slid into the booth seat across from her without being invited. The Harlan meeting is Thursday. You agreed. I didn't agree to anything. I said I'd think about it. Well, he smiled. The smile didn't reach anything. You've had time. Tristan. Her voice dropped half a register. I need you to leave. A beat of silence. Something shifted in the man's posture, nearly invisible, the kind of shift you only caught if you were trained to catch it or if you had grown up watching for it in other people. Then he reached across the table and closed his hand around her wrist. Not violent, just certain. The casual certainty of someone who expected the gesture to be sufficient. Graham was out of his booth before he had made any conscious decision to move. He didn't rush. He didn't make a scene. He crossed the 12 feet between his table and theirs at a pace that was deliberate and unhurried, and he stood at the end of their booth and said simply, "Let go of her arm." Tristan looked up. He took in Graham in approximately 1 second. The work clothes, the jeans with the smear of motor oil on the left knee that hadn't quite washed out, the calloused hands, the general impression of a man who fixed things for a living. Whatever calculation he ran, it concluded quickly. This doesn't involve you, Tristan said. His tone was patient in the particular way that men were patient when they assumed the conversation was already over. I'm making it involve me. Graham held the man's gaze. He was not angry. Anger burned fuel you needed for other things. He was simply present in the way that years of training had taught him to be present, completely, without distraction, without any part of his attention wandering anywhere else. Take your hand off her arm. Something moved through Tristan's expression, a flicker of reassessment. The suit and the shoes and the assumptions made by them were still there, but something in Graham's stillness wasn't quite fitting into the expected category of interfering nobody from a small town. His hand didn't move. Graham reached down and placed 2 fingers against the back of Tristan's wrist, not gripping, not squeezing, just contact, and applied a very specific and precise amount of pressure to a very specific location. Tristan's hand opened. Involuntarily, quickly, the way a hand opens when the message from the wrist to the brain gets briefly and efficiently interrupted. He yanked his arm back. What the? Time to leave, Graham said. Same even tone. He placed himself between the table and the aisle, not threatening, not escalating, simply occupying the space in a way that made certain things clear without requiring anyone to shout about them. He looked at Tristan with the steady, unhurried attention of a man who had genuinely faced scarier things and found them manageable. For a long moment, Tristan sat there. His jaw was tight. The silver at his temples caught the light. He was running a different kind of calculation now, slower, and whatever it produced did not land where he expected. He got up, smoothed his coat. This is a private matter, he said, to no one in particular, or possibly to the cafe as a whole, or possibly to preserve some internal version of events. I'll be in touch, he added to Elara. Not a threat? Not quite. More like a weather forecast. He left. The door stuck briefly in its frame, then gave. The cafe settled back into itself. Nina pretended to wipe down a counter she'd already wiped twice. The man with the muffin looked back at his tablet. The woman with the stroller had missed most of it. Graham stood there for another few seconds, making sure, before he looked down at the woman still sitting in the booth. She was looking up at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Not quite relieved. Something more complicated than that. She had let out a slow breath, and her left hand had lifted off the table, and she was holding it curled loosely in her lap, like she didn't quite know what to do with it yet. "You okay?" Graham asked. "Yeah." Then she shook her head slightly. "No. Maybe." A pause. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. He might be in the parking lot." That startled something out of her. Not a full laugh, but close to it. A kind of exhaled surprise. "Right." Graham glanced at the door. Nothing through the glass but the gray morning and an empty stretch of sidewalk. He looked back at her. "Do you want me to call someone? Or stay until you're ready to leave?" She looked at him. Really looked, for the first time, in the way you looked at someone when you were trying to figure out what they actually were. He understood the impulse. People did unexpected things, and the question of why was always relevant. "I'm fine," she said. Then she seemed to reconsider the word. "I will be fine." "Okay." Graham nodded. He started to turn back toward his booth. "I'm Elara," she said. "Elara Winscott." He stopped, looked back. She had her hand out, slightly awkward, half extended across the table. He reached over and shook it. "Graham Vossler. Do you live here, in Hadley Falls?" "All my life." "Is it always like this?" He thought about that. "No. Usually quieter. Though last month somebody drove a riding mower into the pharmacy, so the bar for unusual is kind of high." She laughed this time. A real one, brief, catching her slightly off guard. It changed her face. "I was trying to have a quiet morning," she said. "Looked like it was going okay until about 8:43. Something shifted in her expression. Not a smile, but the precursor to one. "I'm going to assume you didn't memorize the time." "I was checking my phone like—" He paused. "Permission slip. Did you sign it?" "I forgot to sign it." "Classic." She looked at her coffee cup. "Can I ask, how did you do that?" "The wrist thing. That wasn't a move a mechanic usually has." Graham considered the question. It wasn't intrusive exactly, just direct, and he respected directness more than he used to. "I wasn't always a mechanic," he said. She waited. He didn't offer more, and she didn't push. "Fair enough," she said. He went back to his booth. He finished his coffee. He was aware, in the peripheral way of someone who had trained himself not to be obvious about noticing things, that she stayed another 20 minutes, wrote in her notebook, and only looked at the door twice more before gathering her things and leaving without hurry. Nina swung by to refill what was by now a fourth cup Graham hadn't asked for. "That was something," Nina said, with the satisfied tone of someone who had witnessed an event worth discussing for several weeks. "It was fine," Graham said. "You know who that was he was talking to?" Said her name was Elara Winscott. Nina made a sound that was difficult to categorize. "Winscott, right." She moved away with the coffee pot before he could ask what that meant. Graham drove back to the garage with the heater in the truck running at full power and mostly inadequate, and he pulled Hector Bunn's listing Ranger into the bay at 9:58 and spent the rest of the morning replacing a water pump and thinking, with the detached curiosity of someone who had decided not to think about something, about a woman who watched the door with her hand pressed flat against a café table. He signed the permission slip at lunch. It was due that day. He drove it over to the school himself rather than putting it in Maisie's backpack, where it would go directly into whatever pocket dimension her backpack operated on, handed it to the front office woman who accepted it with the controlled disappointment of someone who had expected exactly this, and drove back to the garage. He picked Maisie up at 3:23. She had apparently reached a new development in the Devlin situation. Devlin had eaten a second glue stick, voluntarily this time, to demonstrate that the first had not been a fluke, and she delivered this information with the gravity of someone reporting significant news. "That kid is going to be fine," Graham told her. "Dad, he ate 2 glue sticks." "I know. He's going to be completely fine." Maisie considered this with deep skepticism. They ate dinner. He made pasta from the box, and she ate it with the uncritical enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who found boxed pasta entirely satisfactory and had not yet developed opinions about the alternative. She told him about her drawing she'd made in art class, a house with what she described as realistic smoke coming from the chimney, which turned out to mean a lot of gray scribbles. And he washed the dishes and helped her with reading homework and sat with her while she fell asleep with a book open across her chest. He moved the book, turned off the lamp, stood in the doorway for a moment, the way he did. He thought about the woman in the cafe again, briefly, cleanly, in the way you thought about things that were finished. He went to bed. He thought it was done. He was wrong about that. She came back 3 days later. Graham was underneath a '09 Silverado working on a brake line when he heard tires on the gravel, and he rolled out on the creeper expecting Hector Bunn, who had mentioned something vague about a rattle near the rear axle, and instead found a gray sedan he didn't recognize parked at the edge of the lot. He lay there on the creeper for a moment, looking up at the undercarriage of the truck above him, listening to footsteps on the gravel get closer, and then stop. Is this a bad time? He rolled the rest of the way out and sat up. Elara Winscott was standing about 6 feet away, hands in the pockets of a dark jacket, looking at the garage bay with the particular expression of someone who had walked into a situation they were slightly unsure about. She had her hair down today. It was windblown from about 30 seconds outside the car. Graham looked at her, then at the sedan, then back at her. "Depends," he said. "You bring more trouble with you?" "Not today." A pause. "Probably not today." He stood up, pulled a rag from his back pocket, and started working on his hands. They were not going to come clean with one rag. The brake line had been leaking long enough to make a mess of things, but it was something to do while he figured out what this was. "You need a car looked at?" he asked. "No, I just—" She stopped, started again. "I wanted to say thank you properly. The other day in the cafe, I left before I actually said it right." "You said it fine." "I said thank you, and then you made a joke about the parking lot and I laughed, and then you went back to your booth. That's not saying it right." Graham considered this. "Okay," he said. "You're welcome." She looked around the garage. The bay doors were both open because the morning was clear enough to let in real light, and the space heater in the corner handled the rest. There was the Silverado, a Honda Civic with a cracked windshield waiting on a part, and against the far wall, his rolling tool cabinet that had been his father's and still had the dent in the bottom drawer from a dropped rotor sometime in 1987. "My father had a garage," she said, surprised sounding, like she hadn't meant to say it. "What kind?" "Smaller than this. He did lawnmowers mostly, outdoor equipment, but the smell is the same." She looked at the cabinet against the wall. Oil and metal and something like sawdust, even when there isn't any sawdust. Graham watched her. She wasn't performing anything. She was just standing in his garage in her dark jacket with her wind-blown hair, looking at his father's tool cabinet with an expression that had nothing calculated in it. "You want coffee?" he asked. "I have to warn you, it's terrible." "Worse than the copperfinch?" "Significantly." She almost smiled. "Yeah, okay." The coffee was terrible. He knew it was terrible. It had been terrible since approximately the day he bought the machine, which had been on sale at the hardware store 3 years ago for a reason that only became clear after the first pot. Elara took the mug he handed her, sipped it, and had the decency not to react visibly for a full 3 seconds. "It's very," she said, "robust." That's the word people use. "What word do you use?" "I usually say bad." She laughed. A real one, the same way she had in the cafe, catching her slightly off guard, like laughter was something her face did without always getting clearance first. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the space heater doing its uncertain best in the corner. "Are you from here originally?" Graham asked. "Hadley Falls." "No, I grew up in Connecticut. I'm just—" She paused fractionally. "Passing through, kind of." The fractional pause was there. There. Graham filed it away without examining it. "That guy from the cafe," he said. Not a question exactly. Her expression shifted, tightened slightly around the edges. "He's not going to be a problem." "I didn't ask if he'd be a problem. I asked—" He stopped. "Actually, I didn't ask anything. Forget it." "He's someone I used to know professionally," she said. He had expectations about the future that I didn't share, and he's having a hard time adjusting his understanding of that. Okay. That's a very polite version of it. I figured. She looked at him over the rim of the mug. You're not going to ask more? Not my business. You made it your business 3 days ago. That was different. He had his hand on you. She was quiet for a moment. Most people don't step in, she said. I've noticed that. People look. They find something else to look at. It's not... She stopped. I'm not criticizing them. It's just how people are. It's uncomfortable, and the easier thing is to let it be someone else's problem. Yeah, well, Graham shrugged. I wasn't busy. You were reading your phone. Like I said. She looked at him for a long moment, like she was running that same calculation she'd run in the café, trying to locate the category this man belonged to and not quite finding a matching slot. Can I ask you something? She said. Sure. You said you weren't always a mechanic. I did say that. What were you before? The question was direct without being pushy, the same way the one in the cafe had been. Graham wiped his hands again with the rag, even though he'd already gotten most of it. Navy, he said. SEALs. She didn't react the way people sometimes did. The slightly theatrical, impressed expression, the questions about whether he'd killed anyone, the sudden reassessment that came with putting a label on something that had previously been unlabeled. She just nodded, like it was a data point that fit into a space she'd been holding open. That explains the wrist thing, she said. It explains a few things. Why'd you leave? He looked at her. Why'd you drive from Connecticut to a small cafe in Hadley Falls, New York in October? A moment of silence. She almost smiled again. Fair. The Honda's part was supposed to arrive by noon. He told her that, and she took it as the natural end of the conversation, rinsed the mug in the small utility sink by the sidewall. He hadn't expected that, and walked back toward her car. At the edge of the gravel, she stopped. The coffee really is terrible, she said. I'm probably going to avoid it in the future. Smart. But the garage is nice. She got in the car and left. Graham stood in the open bay door watching the gray sedan pull onto Route 9, and then he went back to the Silverado's brake line and didn't think about it, or tried not to, which was a somewhat different thing. She came back on Friday, then the following Tuesday, then Thursday. She always had a reason that was technically plausible. She was in town anyway. She'd been meaning to ask about a tire pressure sensor on the rental that was giving her trouble. She had brought him something from the actual bakery 2 towns over because she felt guilty about making him drink his own coffee. The reasons were the kind that didn't quite hold up to scrutiny, but also didn't require any, because neither of them scrutinized them. She told him she was freelancing, consulting work, remote, nothing she needed to be in an office for. She was renting a place on the far side of Hadley Falls, one of those short-term rentals that the owners listed from October through March, because nobody wanted to be there then, which meant the price was manageable and the neighbors were sparse. He told her about the garage, about taking it over from his father, about the fact that in a town this size, everyone eventually brought every car they'd ever owned through your bay, if you waited long enough. He told her about Maisie and the careful, measured way he talked about Maisie with people he didn't know well. Enough that her existence was understood, not so much that it became an invitation for questions he wasn't ready for. How old? Elara asked. 8. What's she like? He thought about it. The actual Maisie, not the summarized version. She's relentless, he said. In a good way. She wants to understand everything. If I give her an explanation she doesn't think is sufficient, she asks a follow-up question. She will ask follow-up questions indefinitely until she has the answer she was actually looking for. She sounds exhausting. Extremely. You love it. He looked at her. Yeah, I do. She had been in the garage for 3 weeks when she met Maisie. It happened by accident. School let out early for some kind of staff training day, and Graham had miscalculated the timing. So Maisie arrived at the garage on her own, walked through the side door she'd known about since she was 5, and found a woman she didn't recognize sitting on the old stool by the parts cabinet drinking a bottle of water and reading something on her phone. Maisie stopped in the doorway. Who are you? She asked. Not unfriendly. Genuinely curious, the same way she approached most things. Elara looked up. Something moved through her expression. A quick adjustment, a recalibration. Elara, she said, I've been bothering your dad while he works. Maisie looked at her father, who had emerged from under a lifted F-150 and was wiping grease off his forearms. "Is she a customer?" "Sort of," Graham said. "She doesn't look like a customer." "What do customers look like?" Elara asked, genuinely curious. Maisie considered this seriously. "Like they need something fixed. You look like you're waiting for something." A short silence. "That's pretty accurate," Elara said. Maisie appeared to decide something. She walked the rest of the way into the garage, dropped her backpack beside the stool, and climbed up onto the end of the workbench where Graham kept a section deliberately clear for exactly this purpose. "I'm Maisie," she said. "I know. Your dad mentioned you." "What did he say?" "That you ask follow-up questions until you get the answer you were actually looking for." Maisie nodded with the satisfaction of someone receiving accurate information. "That's true." She looked at Elara with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of someone who had not yet learned to make evaluations subtle. "Do you know anything about cars?" "Almost nothing." "Dad knows everything about cars." "So I've gathered." "He knows a lot of other things too," Maisie said, "but he doesn't talk about them usually." Graham from under the truck said, "Maisie." "What?" "It's true." He came out from under the truck and looked at his daughter with an expression that she returned with complete serenity. That was how it started. Maisie was not a child who warmed to strangers easily. She was friendly, had her mother's capacity for genuine interest in other people, but she held a sort of internal reserve that she released at her own pace and on her own schedule, and no amount of adult charm or effort seemed to accelerate it. Graham had watched grandparents, teachers, the parents of her classmates spend considerable effort trying to get Maisie to relax around them, with limited results. She liked Elara almost immediately, not in an obvious way, in the quiet way she had of deciding things. A slight turn toward rather than away, a willingness to talk, the follow-up questions directed at someone new rather than just at her father. By the third time Elara was there when Maisie came in after school, they had a running conversation about something to do with whether certain animals could technically be considered more useful than cars, a debate Maisie had apparently initiated and Elara had gamely picked up and carried. "The thing is," Maisie said, with great seriousness, "a horse doesn't need a water pump." "A horse needs a lot of water, though," Elara said. "So you've traded one water problem for a different water problem. Horses just drink it themselves. You don't have to fix anything. You have to fix it when the horse is sick. That's what vets are for. That's what mechanics are for with cars." Maisie opened her mouth, closed it. This was apparently a counter she hadn't seen coming. She turned to her father. "Dad?" "I'm staying out of this one," Graham said. She turned back to Elara with the expression of someone who had been ambushed but wasn't finished. Graham watched them from across the garage without appearing to watch them. I was replacing spark plugs, and he could do it without much conscious attention, which meant his attention was elsewhere, doing the thing he'd told himself not to do, which was notice things. He noticed that Elara was good with Maisie in the specific way that was hard to perform, not talking down, not being artificially playful, just engaging with whatever Maisie brought to the table as if it were worth engaging with, which it usually was. But a lot of adults forgot that. He noticed that Elara looked younger when she was arguing about horses with an 8-year-old. She looked less like someone who watched the door. He noticed himself noticing all of this, which was the part he didn't like. The dinner happened on a Thursday in early November. It was not planned, or it was planned the way things get planned when no one admits they're planning them. Graham had been going to make chicken and rice because that was Thursday, chicken and rice was Thursday, and he had thawed it that morning. Elara had been at the garage longer than usual because she'd been talking to Maisie about a school project and lost track of time, and it was nearly 6, and Maisie said with complete casual certainty, "You should just stay for dinner." Graham looked at his daughter. Maisie looked back at him with the perfectly blank expression she used when she was doing something she intended to do regardless of his position on it. "It's just chicken and rice," Graham said to Elara. "Nothing special." "I like chicken and rice," Elara said. "It's from a box." "I won't tell anyone." He fed them both at the kitchen table with the slightly wobbly leg that he'd been meaning to fix for 2 years and had worked around instead. Maisie talked for most of the meal. She told Elara about the school project, which involved the water cycle, which Maisie found interesting but also suspected was less complicated than it was being presented. She talked about Devlin, who had graduated from glue sticks to eating a corner of a worksheet, and was now regarded by the class with a kind of cautious celebrity. She talked about the book she was reading, which was about a dog that got separated from its family and then found them again. And she was at the part where they got separated, and she was not yet at the part where they found each other, and she wanted to know if Elara thought they definitely got back together, or if that was just what the cover made you hope. "I think they get back together," Elara said. "You can't know that. The cover looks very hopeful. The cover might be lying." "Covers usually tell you what kind of book it is," Elara said. "If the cover is warm and the dog is looking towards something in the distance, it's telling you the ending." Maisie stared at her. "That's cheating." "It's just reading the signals." Maisie considered this with enormous reluctance. "Fine," she said, "but I'm not sure I believe it." Then she ate more rice, clearly still thinking about it. Graham looked at Elara across the table. She was cutting her chicken with the same focus she brought to most things. She felt the look and glanced up. He didn't say anything. She went back to her plate. After dinner, Maisie disappeared to her room to do homework of debatable urgency, and Graham washed the dishes and Elara dried them without being asked, which again he hadn't expected, and they stood at the kitchen sink and she handed dishes back to be put in cabinets. She didn't know the arrangement of, which meant he had to take each one and she had to wait, which was slower and more domestic and more strange than it had any right to be. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know." She handed him a plate. "I wanted to." He put the plate in the cabinet. She handed him another one. "She's great," Elara said. "Maisie." "I know." "She's going to be—" She stopped. "I was going to say a handful when she grows up, but she's already a handful, isn't she?" "Has been since she could talk." "How long have you been doing this by yourself?" He took a moment before answering. 4 years. She didn't fill the silence with condolence. He appreciated that. She just handed him a glass and let the number sit there the way it deserved to sit. Not too lightly, not weighted down with pity. "It suits you," she said. "You're good at it." "Some days." "Most days, from what I can see." "You've seen about 6 hours total." "I can extrapolate." He looked at her. She was looking at the sink, rinsing the last pot with the slightly unnecessary thoroughness of someone who was keeping their hands busy. The kitchen light was the overhead kind, not flattering to anyone, and she didn't look like she cared about that, and he found himself suddenly very aware that she was standing about 2 feet away from him in his kitchen drying his dishes, and that this was either something or nothing, and that he didn't know which, and that the not knowing was the part that was starting to feel like a problem. "I should go," she said. "Yeah." She folded the dish towel and put it back on the counter. He walked her to the door. On the porch she stopped and looked at the sky, which was clear, which happened in November sometimes. Completely cold and completely clear and full of more stars than you expected after a whole day of nothing. "This town is very quiet," she said. "It's always quiet." "I like it." He wanted to say something. He had the distinct awareness of a sentence forming somewhere in the vicinity of his chest that he didn't particularly want to let out, and he successfully did not let it out. "Drive safe," he said. She looked at him for just a second longer than the situation required. Then she went down the porch steps and got in the gray sedan and backed down the driveway, and the taillights disappeared around the bend, and Graham stood on the porch in the cold for about 60 seconds, doing nothing in particular before going back inside. Maisie called from her room. "Is she gone?" "Yeah." A pause. "I like her, Dad." Graham turned off the kitchen light. "I know, Bug." "She's funny, but like actually funny, not fake funny." "Go to sleep." "I'm doing homework." "Go to sleep." A very long pause that was almost certainly Maisie deciding whether to push this. Then, "Fine." He went to bed and lay there in the dark and thought about nothing for a long time, which was another way of saying he thought about a lot of things and managed to not quite look at any of them directly. November stretched into Thanksgiving, which Graham and Maisie spent the same way they'd spent the last 3, at his sister Carol's house 20 minutes away, with Carol's husband Pete and their 2 kids and a turkey that Carol somehow simultaneously overcooked and underprepared every single year, and for which everyone at the table was inexplicably grateful. It was loud and disorganized, and Maisie ran around the backyard with her cousins for 2 hours in the cold and came in with red cheeks and would not stop talking in the car on the way home. He didn't see Elara for 10 days over that stretch. She'd mentioned she might go back to Connecticut for a while. She didn't say why. She texted once, just a picture of a particularly bad coffee from somewhere that was clearly an airport, with no accompanying message. And he replied with a thumbs up, which he immediately felt was inadequate and also correct. When she came back, she was quieter. Not sad exactly. Compressed. Like she'd been someplace that had pressed on her in ways she was still working through. She didn't talk about it, and he didn't ask. They went back to the garage and the terrible coffee and Maisie's running argument about the theoretical superiority of animals over internal combustion engines. But something was different. Graham wasn't sure when he first noticed it. It was the kind of thing that arrived gradually, the way the weather changed. Not a single moment, but a cumulative shift until one day you realized it was a different season than it had been. She started spending more time at the house, whole evenings. She went to Maisie's school play in the second week of December, sitting one seat down from Graham in the folding chairs in the gymnasium, watching Maisie perform what was described as the role of second tree, with a level of commitment that suggested Maisie intended to be the most meaningful tree in the history of the production. Elara leaned over during the first act and said quietly, "She is absolutely the best tree up there." And Graham said, "She would never accept anything less." And they sat there in the gymnasium's slightly too warm air and watched his daughter stand very still with her arms out while other kids said their lines around her. And it was such a normal and small thing, and Graham was aware of it in his body in a way that normal and small things usually didn't register. They walked by the river on a Sunday afternoon while Maisie ran ahead to throw things into the water and report on how they floated. The light was the low-angled kind that December afternoons produced, coming in sideways across the water and making everything look slightly gilded and colder than it was. Elara had her hands in her pockets, and her jacket zipped, and she was watching Maisie sprint from one spot on the bank to another with an expression he had started to recognize, the one that meant she was here, really here, not in whatever other place she went when she got quiet. "What do you actually do?" he asked. Not aggressively. It had just been sitting there for a while, and the afternoon seemed to have room for it. She kept her eyes on Maisie. "What do you mean?" "You said consulting, remote work, but you've been in Hadley Falls for 6 weeks and you don't seem to do much of it. You're here most days." She was quiet for a moment, not caught out quiet, considering quiet. "I do some of it early in the morning," she said, "and late at night sometimes." "What kind of consulting?" "Business." A pause. "Corporate structure, strategy. I'm good at figuring out how organizations are broken and how to fix them." "Sounds like the garage, kind of." She laughed, short and genuine. "Kind of." He waited. She reached down and picked up a flat stone from the edge of the path, looked at it, and didn't throw it. "I needed some time," she said, "away from a particular context. Hadley Falls seemed like the right distance." "Distance from what?" She turned the stone over in her fingers. "From being known as one particular thing." A pause. "From people who only see one layer." He thought about that. He thought about the man in the café, the coat, and the shoes, and the certainty. He thought about the way she'd said his name. "That guy," he said. "Tristan. He's part of the world you needed distance from." "Yes." "How much part?" She finally threw the stone. It skipped twice before sinking. "More than I'd like him to be." Maisie came running back, excited about a branch she had discovered that floated in what she described as an interesting way, and the conversation closed itself naturally, the way conversations sometimes did when children were present, and Graham let it close. But he filed it away with the other things he'd filed away without examining, which were adding up now into a collection that was beginning to have a particular shape, the shape of something he was going to have to look at eventually, whether he wanted to or not. He told himself he wasn't afraid of that. He told himself that for 3 more weeks before he almost started to believe it. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of January, Maisie called him from the playground. She called him from the school playground. On his cell, which she was only supposed to do in an emergency, which she understood, which meant she had decided this qualified. "Dad," she said. Her voice was the careful, controlled kind she used when she was scared and didn't want to sound it. "There are 2 men outside the fence." He was already reaching for his keys. "What do they look like, Bug?" "Suits. They're just watching. They have a phone, and one of them is taking pictures." "Can you see their car?" "Black. Big. It doesn't have the school name on it." I want you to go directly inside. Don't run. Just walk to Ms. Delaney and tell her your dad is coming. Don't go near the fence. Dad, Maisie, walk, okay? A pause. Okay. He covered the 6 blocks in under 4 minutes. The black SUV was still at the curb when he pulled in. One man sitting in it. The second one standing on the sidewalk, back to the fence now, phone in his coat pocket. Graham parked, got out, and walked toward him with the deliberate, unhurried pace that meant something specific to anyone who knew how to read it. The man was mid-40s, nondescript coat. He registered Graham's approach and did his own assessment, and whatever he concluded made him decide to stay where he was, which Graham respected more than if he'd left immediately. "Who sent you?" Graham asked. "I don't know what you mean." "You were photographing children on a school playground. I'm going to ask you one more time." The man looked at him, looked at his face specifically, and something in the calculation shifted. "We were just in the area," he said. "Get in your car and go back to wherever Tristan Vale sent you from. And tell him that the next time he points anyone at my daughter's school, the conversation goes differently." He said it flat and low, without drama. "Do you understand what I said?" A long moment. The man walked to the SUV, got in. It pulled away. Graham stood on the sidewalk until it was completely out of sight. Then he walked through the school's front entrance, which buzzed him through after about 15 seconds that felt longer, and found Maisie sitting in a chair outside the main office, with her backpack on her lap and her coat still zipped, looking at the door. When she saw him, something in her face changed. Not relief exactly. Something that hurt more than relief because it was the version of it that meant she'd been afraid something else might happen instead. He sat down beside her. Didn't say anything immediately. She leaned into him slightly, and he put his arm around her, and they sat there in the hallway of Hadley Falls Elementary with the fluorescent lights overhead and the distant sound of children somewhere doing the normal things children did. "They're gone," he said. "Did you know them?" "No." She was quiet. "But you know who sent them?" He thought about how to answer that. "I think so." "Elara," Maisie said. Not a question. He looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "Because she's the only new thing," Maisie said simply. His 8-year-old daughter, relentless and precise and absolutely right. He texted Elara, "Need to talk, tonight." Her reply came back in under a minute. "I know. I'll come to you." He drove home with Maisie in the passenger seat and the heater going and neither of them speaking for most of the way, which was not their usual silence, the comfortable kind. This silence had weight. Graham kept his eyes on the road and his hands on the wheel and let himself feel, for the first time since October, what had actually been building in him across all those weeks of garage coffee and chicken and rice dinners and December afternoons by the river. Fear. Not the operational kind, not the kind that sharpened you, the kind that understood what it had to lose. Elara arrived at 7:15. Graham had fed Maisie early. Reheated soup from the previous night, toast, the fast functional dinner of a man with other things pressing on him. And Maisie had eaten it without complaint, which told him she understood the situation required a version of herself that didn't ask for anything extra. She was perceptive that way, had been since she was small. She read rooms the way other kids read picture books. He got her settled with a chapter book in her bedroom and told her Elara was coming over to talk and that he'd check on her in a bit. Maisie looked at him over the book with the particular expression she had that meant she knew more than she was being told and was making a deliberate decision to let that go for now. "Okay," she said. He went back downstairs and stood in the kitchen not doing anything until he heard the gray sedan on the gravel. Elara came to the door before he could open it, knocked once, and he let her in. She was still in the clothes she'd been wearing that afternoon, dark pants, a gray sweater, but she'd been somewhere between then and now, because her face had the slightly hollowed look of someone who had spent the intervening hours having a conversation with themselves they'd been putting off for weeks. She stood in his entryway. He stood in his kitchen doorway. "How's Maisie?" she asked first. "She's okay." She was scared. She's handling it better than she should have to. Elara closed her eyes briefly. One short breath. Then she opened them. "I'm sorry." "Tell me the truth," Graham said. "All of it." She nodded. She went to the kitchen table, the one with the wobbly leg, and sat down in the chair she'd sat in for chicken and rice and for leftover soup and for every other meal she'd eaten here over the past months. Graham sat across from her, The overhead light did what it always did, which was illuminate everything without flattering anything. "My name isn't Elara Winscott," she said. He waited. "It's Elara Montclair. Winscott was my mother's name. I use it sometimes when I don't want to be recognized." She looked at the table surface. "My family started Montclair Group about 50 years ago. It's a holding company, primarily. Investments, real estate, some pharmaceutical subsidiaries. My grandfather built it, my father grew it, and when my father died 6 years ago, it passed to me." "You inherited it." "I run it. There's a difference." She looked up at him. "I've been CEO for 6 years. I'm not a figurehead. I'm the controlling shareholder and the operational head. When I say it's mine, I mean I make the decisions. All of them, ultimately." Graham absorbed this. He thought about the woman who had sat in the Copper Finch Café watching the door. He thought about the woman who had dried his dishes and argued with his daughter about horses. He tried to reconcile those with what she was describing and found that they weren't entirely incompatible, which was maybe the part that surprised him most. "How big?" he asked. "At last valuation?" She paused. "Somewhere between $8 and $9 billion. The number sat on the table between them. "Tristan Vale," Graham said. "Tristan is on our board. He's also the primary shareholder of a company we've been in merger discussions with for almost 2 years. If the merger goes through, it creates one of the largest private real estate investment portfolios in the country." She picked at the edge of her thumbnail. It was the first time he'd seen her do anything like that. A small, involuntary habit, unpolished. "Tristan decided several years ago that the cleanest way to secure the merger was to marry me. He's been," she searched for the right word, "persistent. Persistent enough to send men to photograph my daughter's school." Her jaw tightened. "That wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to be looking for me. They must have followed you from the garage and assumed—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what they assumed. It happened, and I'm sorry." Graham was quiet for a long moment. In the ceiling above them, he could hear Maisie shifting on her bed, the faint creak of the mattress. He knew her sounds the way he knew the sounds of the garage, the specific groan of each thing, what it meant, whether it needed attention. "Why Hadley Falls?" he asked. Elara looked at him. "I needed to think. Away from—" She gestured vaguely. "All of it. I have a college friend who grew up near here. She mentioned it once as the kind of place that existed at a different pace. I just—" A pause. "I drove until I felt far enough, and this is where I stopped. And the cafe. I eat breakfast alone when I'm thinking. It helps." Something moved through her expression. "And then you." He looked at her face in the kitchen light, and he thought about 3 months. He thought about Maisie calling from the playground with her careful, controlled voice. He thought about the gray sedan on the gravel every few days, and how his garage had started to feel different with her in it, and how he had very carefully not looked at any of that directly. "What does Tristan actually want?" he asked. "Control. The merger would give him that. Not over me, over the company's real estate arm. Getting me to agree to marry him would secure his position on the board, regardless of whether the merger goes through." She said it with the flat precision of someone describing a business strategy, because that was exactly what it was. "He's not interested in me. He's interested in what comes with me." "And you've told him no?" "Repeatedly." "And he followed you here?" "Yes." "And had men photograph my daughter's playground?" She met his eyes. "Yes." He got up, went to the counter, came back with nothing. He'd moved purely to move, to have somewhere to put the energy accumulating in his chest. He sat back down. "Elara." He said her real name, her actual name, and she registered it. "What I need to know is whether this, whatever this has been, whether it made things more complicated for you with him." "Being here made things more complicated," she said carefully. "You specifically—" She stopped. "Say it." "You made him angry. The cafe, and then whatever happened today at the school. He sees you as—" She chose the next word with visible discomfort. "Interference." "Good," Graham said. She looked at him. "Graham, he put men outside my daughter's school. I want him to see me as interference. That's not—" She pressed her fingers to her forehead for a moment. "That's not going to make him go away. Tristan doesn't respond to confrontation by backing down. He responds by escalating. The way he works is he applies pressure from multiple directions at once until the path of least resistance becomes doing what he wants. That works on boards and shareholders, Graham said. It doesn't necessarily work everywhere. You don't know what his resources look like. I have some idea of what his resources look like. I've met him twice. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. What I want to know is what you want to do. She stared at him. I'm not... He pushed through the awkwardness of the sentence. I'm not asking about the merger or the company. I'm asking what you want. Because right now it looks like you ran away from your life and landed here, and I need to know if this is a hiding place or if it's something else. Because if it's a hiding place, then maybe we're talking about one kind of problem. But if it's something else, then we're talking about a different kind. The silence that followed was the long, uncomfortable kind, the kind that meant the question had landed. I don't know, she said. Quiet. Honest. He looked at her for a long moment. Okay, he said. That's an honest answer. She looked at her hands. I know what it started as. I needed distance, and this was far enough. And then I met you, and Maisie, and She stopped. I stopped thinking about it as temporary. I stopped thinking about going back as the inevitable outcome. Another pause. That wasn't fair to you. I should have told you who I was sooner. Yeah, he said. You should have. She accepted that without deflecting it. How much of the consulting was real, he asked. All of it. I've been running the company remotely. My executive team knows where I am. I have a board meeting via video call every other week. I've been managing it from here. A slight wry edge. The Montclair group functions about the same whether I'm in the Manhattan office or a rental in Hadley Falls, which says something, probably, about the difference between being needed and being present. He thought about that. About a woman who ran a $9 billion company from a short-term rental and made time to argue about horses with his daughter and dry his dishes and watch Maisie stand very still on stage being a tree with total conviction. I need to think, he said. She nodded. She stood up, picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. Graham. She said his name the way he'd said hers, precisely, deliberately. Maisie was never supposed to be near any of this. I want you to know that I understand what happened today is not acceptable. And if you tell me that the safest thing for her is for me to leave Hadley Falls, I will. He looked at her. I'll go, she said, if that's what you need. I won't make this harder than it already is. He didn't answer right away. She waited, which was another thing he'd come to understand about her. She didn't fill silences unnecessarily. She let them be what they were. Let me think, he said. She left. He stood in the kitchen for a while after the taillights disappeared, and then he went upstairs and sat on the edge of Maisie's bed. She was still awake, which he'd known she would be. Dad, she said, before he could say anything. Yeah. Is she in trouble? Some. Can you help her? He looked at his daughter's face in the dim light from the hallway. She was 8 years old, and she asked the question with the directness and simplicity of someone who had not yet learned to complicate things that were actually not complicated. Maybe, he said. Maisie accepted this with the gravity it deserved. I think you should, she said. He pulled the blanket up. Sleep, bug. I'm thinking. Think with your eyes closed. A pause, then quietly. She didn't know she was going to like us so much. I could tell. It surprised her. Graham was very still for a moment. Yeah, he said. I think that's right. That's how you know it's real, Maisie said. When it surprises you. He didn't have an answer to that. He kissed the top of her head and turned off the light and went to his room and lay in the dark for a long time. The next 2 weeks were difficult in the specific way of things that haven't broken yet, but are under significant pressure. Graham told himself he was thinking. He was thinking about Maisie's safety, about Tristan's reach, about the practical implications of whatever was happening between himself and a woman who controlled $9 billion and hadn't told him about it for 3 months. Those were legitimate things to think about. What he was less willing to think about was the part that was actually driving his thoughts, which was simpler and more frightening than corporate mergers and billionaires and men in suits outside school fences. The part that was just, he had let her in. He had let her into the garage and the dinner table and the school plays and the river walks and the kitchen, and he had let Maisie love her, which was worse, which was so much worse, Because Maisie had already lost one person, and Graham had made himself a promise about that. He had promised himself he would not let that happen again. Elara came to the garage twice in those 2 weeks. Both times were brief. She was giving him the space he'd asked for, which he recognized and which somehow made the situation feel more pressured rather than less. On the second visit, she updated him on Tristan. He had returned to New York. His attorney had sent her a letter regarding the merger timeline. She had sent a response through her own legal team. She reported it the way she reported most things, clearly, without drama, with all the relevant facts. She also told him something she'd apparently decided to tell him, which was that before she'd driven to Hadley Falls in October, she had been in the process of formally rejecting the merger. That the merger itself she could survive either way, but the condition Tristan had attached to it, herself, was not a condition she had ever been willing to meet. She had simply needed to be somewhere that wasn't his city and wasn't her office when she made that final clear. "I want you to know that," she said, in the garage, standing by the parts cabinet where Maisie usually sat. "Whatever happens between us or doesn't happen, he was never going to get what he wanted. That part was decided before I drove through Hadley Falls." Graham was tightening a lug nut and did not look up immediately. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I don't want you to think that you and Maisie are complications in a situation I haven't already chosen my position on. You're not collateral in my decision. The decision was made." He looked up then. She was standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, exactly the way she'd stood in the garage 3 months ago, the first time she'd come back. But she was not the same. Neither was he. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He looked back at the lug nut. Tristan came to Hadley Falls himself in the last week of January. Not to the school this time. He came to the garage. Graham was alone. Maisie was at school. The morning was quiet. When the black car pulled in, he was not surprised. He had been expecting something, and this was the shape it took. Tristan got out wearing the same kind of coat he'd worn in the café. He looked at the garage with the expression of a man locating an unpleasant but necessary item on a to-do list. Then he walked over. "Vossler," he said. "Vale." Graham came out of the bay, wiping his hands. He didn't offer a handshake. "You drove 4 hours. I find things go better in person." Tristan looked around the garage, the tools, the equipment, the old cabinet with the dented drawer. His gaze settled back on Graham with the particular look of a man performing an appraisal. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone easier." He said it without malice, as a simple fact. "I looked into you after the café. Former SEAL, single father, took over his father's garage. You've been in this town your whole life except for 8 years. Service record is—" He paused. "Impressive is probably an understatement." Graham said nothing. "That's not meant as a threat," Tristan continued. "I'm not foolish enough to threaten a former SEAL in his own garage. I'm trying to have a straightforward conversation." "Then have it." Tristan clasped his hands in front of him, a gesture that probably worked well in boardrooms. "Elara is complicated. I suspect you know that by now. She's brilliant, and she's difficult, and she has a particular talent for surrounding herself with people who make her feel ordinary, which is what she wants. She wants to be ordinary." His voice carried something that might have been almost affection if it hadn't been so thoroughly colonized by ownership. "But she's not ordinary. She was never going to stay here, Vossler. This—" a slight gesture at the garage, the gravel, the town beyond it. "This is a chapter. For her. A break from something she'll return to." "Is that what she told you?" "She doesn't have to tell me. I've known her for 11 years. She does this, withdraws, finds somewhere to breathe, then comes back. She always comes back. The company needs her. The board needs her. She understands duty." Graham leaned against the bay door frame. "And you need her." Tristan's expression didn't shift exactly, recalibrated. "We suit each other, professionally, strategically. She knows that." "And personally?" A pause that lasted slightly too long. "What I'm saying to you is that you're a good man, from what I can see. And you have a daughter to think about. Getting attached to Elara Montclair," he said the full name deliberately, "comes with consequences you may not have fully considered." "And the men you sent to photograph my daughter's school?" Silence. "That was not authorized," Tristan said, with the careful precision of a man who had decided on a version of this sentence in advance. "Someone authorized it. Overzealous staff. It won't happen again." "No," Graham said. It won't. They looked at each other. Graham saw what Tristan was doing, and he saw it clearly. The boardroom calm, the presumption of rationality, the framing of Elara as something between an asset and a certainty. The offer of a clean exit positioned as a favor. It was a technique, a good one probably, in most contexts. I think you should leave Hadley Falls, Graham said. Today. Tristan raised an eyebrow. And I think you should tell your legal team that Elara's answer is no. Whatever she's already told them, add this conversation to the record. He pushed off the door frame and stood straight. And I think you should understand that the next time you send anyone near my daughter for any reason, the conversation we have will not happen in my garage. Tristan held his gaze for a long moment. Whatever he found in Graham's face, it moved the calculation. He nodded once, not concession, but a form of acknowledgement, and walked back to the car. Graham watched it pull out onto Route 9. He called Elara. She picked up on the second ring. I saw his car on the main road 20 minutes ago, she said immediately. He came here. A beat of silence. Are you... I'm fine. He wanted to tell me you were temporary. She didn't answer right away. He said you always come back, Graham said, that this is a chapter. Another pause. When she spoke, her voice was measured in a way that meant it was taking some effort to keep it that way. What do you think? He looked at the empty road. I think people tell you who they are by what they assume is inevitable. She was quiet for a moment. Graham, come to the garage this afternoon, he said. Maisie gets out at 3. Come at 2. Okay. He hung up. He went back into the bay and picked up the wrench he'd put down when Tristan's car had pulled in. He stood there holding it for a moment, and then he set it down again because his hands were not quite steady yet, which happened sometimes after the adrenaline started to clear, even now, even years out of the work that had originally caused it. He took a breath. He picked the wrench back up and went back to work. She arrived at 2. He was standing outside the bay when she pulled in, and she got out of the car and looked at him across the gravel. The January air was sharp. The sky was the flat pale blue that came in winter when it was clear and cold and without much generosity. You okay? She said. Yeah. She walked over, stopped a few feet away. I'm sorry he came here. Stop apologizing for him, Graham said. You didn't send him. I know, but She stopped, started again. This isn't the life I wanted to bring to your door. I know. He looked at her. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it without thinking about what I want to hear. She went still. Do you want to go back? He said. To New York. To the company. To all of it. Not because Tristan is pressuring you. Forget Tristan. What do you want? She was quiet for a long time, long enough that a car went past on Route 9 and the sound of it faded and came back as an echo off the building behind them. I want to run the company, she said. I'm good at it, and I believe in what it can be, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. She held his gaze. And I want... A pause. I want what's been happening here. Both of those things. Those are complicated things to want at the same time. I know. He looked at her face. He looked at the woman who had sat in his garage for 3 months and argued with his daughter and dried his dishes and stood on his porch looking at the stars, and never once, not once, made him feel like the world she came from was something he should feel small about. He thought about what Tristan had said. This is a chapter. And he thought about what Maisie had said, quiet in the dark of her room. That's how you know it's real, when it surprises you. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay, what? He shook his head slightly. I needed to know. She looked at him with that expression he'd come to know well, the one that meant she was trying to locate him in a category and couldn't quite manage it. You're not going to ask how it would work, practically? The distance, the company, all of it? I'll ask that later. Right now I just needed the first answer. Something moved through her face, something that was relief and something that was not relief, and something else he didn't have a name for yet. Graham, she said. Elara, he said. And then Maisie's voice reached them from the end of the driveway. The bus had dropped her early. She was walking fast with her backpack swinging. She had spotted Elara's car, and whatever else might have happened in that moment folded itself into the ordinary specific urgency of an 8-year-old who had something important to report. But something had been decided. Both of them felt it. The shape of it was imprecise, and the logistics were impossible, and neither of them had any idea how the practical reality of their two incompatible lives was going to resolve itself. But something underneath all of that had landed on solid ground. The problem was Graham, not Tristan, not the corporation, not the $9 billion or the miles between a garage in Hadley Falls and a boardroom in Manhattan. Graham. He didn't know it yet, fully. It arrived over the following days the way certain kinds of knowledge arrived. First at the edges, then more centrally, until you could no longer claim it wasn't there. He held Maisie's hand at bedtime, and he thought about what it would mean for her, for the specific geography of her small life if this continued. He thought about the school play and the river and the kitchen table and the way Maisie had said "I like her" with such uncomplicated certainty. He thought about his wife, about losing her, about the specific and particular devastation of that. Not just his grief, but Maisie's. Maisie at 4 years old looking at the door in the same way she'd looked at it every day for 6 months afterward. He had promised himself. He had made himself a promise about that. And somewhere in the arithmetic of the days that followed, the fear he'd told himself was about Maisie's safety sorted itself out into its actual components, and he realized that very little of it was actually about Maisie. Maisie was 8, and already wiser than he was about most of this. The fear was his. It had always been his. The thing he was protecting his daughter from was the thing he was most afraid of himself, that he would let someone in completely and then lose her, and that the losing would be the kind that didn't recover from. He told himself he was being prudent. He told himself he was thinking of his daughter. And then he ended it. Not dramatically. He called Elara, not in person. He told himself it was because he didn't want a scene, which was a lie he could almost believe. And he said that he'd been thinking, and that Maisie's safety came first, and that the situation with Tristan was not going to resolve cleanly, and that he thought she should go back. She was quiet for a long time on the other end of the phone. "Is this about Maisie?" she said. "Maisie is the most important thing." "Is this about Maisie?" she asked again. Different emphasis. Not an attack, just precise. He didn't answer that. "Okay," she said. Her voice was the controlled kind, the kind he recognized, that she used when she was scared and didn't want to sound it. "Okay, Graham." She didn't argue. She didn't push. She said she understood, and that she hoped Maisie was okay, and that she was sorry for the complications she'd brought to their lives. He said she didn't have to be sorry. She said she was anyway. And that was it. She was gone inside of 48 hours. The gray sedan was not in the rental driveway when he drove past it, which he did once without deciding to. The short-term rental would sit empty until March the way it always did. The Copper Finch Café was the same as it had always been. Nina refilled his coffee without asking. He told Maisie that Elara had gone back to work, that she'd had things to take care of. He said it matter-of-factly, and he watched his daughter's face receive the information, and he watched something shut down behind her eyes. "Is she coming back?" Maisie asked. "I don't know." Maisie looked at her plate. "Did you ask her to go?" He should have said no. He should have been better at the lie. But Maisie was looking at him with the exact unblinking focus she used when she required the truth, and he had never successfully lied to her directly, and he was not going to start now. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "I did." She didn't yell. She didn't cry at the table. She nodded once, very slightly, and went back to her dinner. And the look on her face, not anger, not even sadness yet, just a kind of quiet that was much worse than either, stayed with Graham long after the plates were washed, and she had gone to bed without asking him to sit with her. Without asking, not explain away as protection. The house felt different that night, and it continued to feel different in the days that followed. The dinner table was too quiet. The garage was quieter than the dinner table. Maisie was not sulking, not acting out, not doing any of the things he might have known how to respond to. She was just diminished somehow. Less of the particular light that was Maisie. A week passed. Then another. And then one evening Graham was washing the dishes alone, and he heard Maisie come into the kitchen. He heard her sit down at the table. He turned off the tap, and when he turned around, she was sitting there with a piece of paper in front of her, folded in half. "I made something," she said. He dried his hands. He sat down across from her, at the table with the wobbly leg. She unfolded the paper. It was a crayon drawing, the kind Maisie made when she was trying to tell him something she didn't know how to say out loud yet, which was how he'd learned over 8 years to understand her truest thoughts. Three figures, drawn with the careful imprecision of a child who was doing her best. The tallest one on the left with dark scribble hair that he understood to be his. A smaller one in the middle with yellow-brown hair, Maisie herself. And the one on the right, same height as the tall one, dark hair, a blue sweater she'd drawn carefully. Above them all, in Maisie's uneven letters, one word, family. Graham looked at the drawing. He looked at it for a long time. "Maisie," he started. "I know you were scared," she said. Her voice was small but not uncertain. "I know that's why you made her go. I wanted to protect you." "I know." She looked at the drawing. "But Dad, I already knew she might leave someday. That's always possible. That's possible with everyone." She looked up at him. "You taught me that. After Mom. You said that things don't last forever, but that doesn't mean you don't have them." He had said that. He didn't remember the exact moment, but he had said it one night years ago when Maisie had asked about her mother, and he had been trying to explain something he barely understood himself. "The thing is," Maisie said, with the directness that had been hers since before she could read, "you weren't protecting me. I wasn't scared. You were scared." She touched the edge of the drawing, and I think a Navy SEAL can be brave enough to be scared. Graham looked at his daughter, 8 years old. He had raised her alone and imperfectly and with considerable ongoing uncertainty, and he had apparently, in the process, produced a person who was significantly wiser than he was about the things that actually mattered. "I'm not saying it's easy," Maisie said quietly. "I'm just saying that sending her away wasn't the brave thing. I think you know that." He picked up the drawing. He looked at the three figures under the word family, and he understood, sitting at his kitchen table with the wobbly leg, that his daughter was right. Had been right this whole time, in the effortless way that children were sometimes right about things adults had buried under too many years of protecting themselves from being wrong. He had not sent Elara away to protect Maisie. He had sent her away because he was terrified of what would happen if he didn't, because she had gotten all the way in, past the garage and the terrible coffee and the dinner table, and into the specific warm center of their small life. And that was the most frightening thing that had happened to him in 4 years. More frightening than Tristan's men at the school fence. More frightening than a stranger in a café with his hand on a woman's wrist. The thing he couldn't survive was not losing someone. He'd survived that. He knew what that cost. The thing he couldn't survive, he had convinced himself, was risking it again. But Maisie had drawn 3 people under one word, and she had slid it across the table and looked at him without accusation, just with the quiet, steady clarity of someone who understood the difference between being brave about the things that might hurt you and being brave about the things you most wanted. Graham folded the drawing carefully along its original crease. He put it in his shirt pocket. He looked at his daughter. "Okay," he said. It was the same word he'd said to Elara in the garage in January when he'd asked what she wanted and she'd told him both things. It meant something different now. Or maybe it meant the same thing at a deeper level. Maisie looked at him with those eyes that had been looking at him with complete unnerving accuracy since she was old enough to look. "Are you going to fix it?" she asked. He thought about a woman in a gray sedan, about a copperfinch cafe and a sticky door and a hand on a wrist, and 12 feet of bad decision that he'd crossed without thinking. He thought about Elara Montclair, who ran a $9 billion company and dried his dishes without being asked, and had looked at his father's tool cabinet with an expression that had nothing calculated in it. He thought about his own fear, which he had dressed up in Maisie's name and called protection, which was the thing he was least proud of. "Yeah," he said, "I'm going to fix it." He didn't call first. He thought about it. He picked up his phone 4 separate times across the evening after Maisie went to bed and put it down each time without dialing, partly because he didn't know what he would say, partly because what he needed to say didn't belong on a phone. It belonged in person, face to face, with no distance between them and no way to interpret tone wrong or hang up when it got difficult. He called Carol instead. His sister picked up on the 3rd ring, which for Carol at 10:30 meant she was still awake and watching something she'd deny watching. "What's wrong?" she said immediately, because Graham calling after 9 had historically meant something was wrong. "Nothing's wrong. I need a favor." A pause. "What kind?" "I need you to take Maisie for a few days, maybe 3, maybe 4. I'm not sure exactly." Another pause, longer. Carol had the quality of someone who assembled complete pictures from minimal information and did it quickly. This is about the woman. Graham looked at the ceiling. How do you know about a woman? Maisie told Pete and Pete told me. Graham, she's 8, not a vault. He closed his eyes briefly. Can you take her or not? Of course I can take her. She can go to school from here. It's only 20 minutes. A pause. Where are you going? New York. He heard Carol absorb this. She made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed something. You're driving to New York for a woman you met in October. Yeah. Okay, Carol said. She didn't add anything to it, which was the thing about Carol he had always been most grateful for. She didn't make people explain themselves more than they already had. Drop her off tomorrow morning. And Graham. What? Comb your hair. He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, the drawing in front of him where Maisie had left it. He looked at the 3 crayon figures under the single word. He thought about what he was actually planning to do, which was drive to New York City to find a woman he had asked to leave his life. A woman who was the CEO of a $9 billion corporation, who was presumably in the middle of whatever crisis his absence had failed to prevent, who had every reasonable right to tell him to turn around and drive back to Hadley Falls and learn something from the experience. He thought about all of that. Then he went to bed, because if he was driving to New York tomorrow, he was going to need sleep, and falling apart about it at 11 at night was not going to produce anything useful. He slept badly, but he slept. In the morning, he drove Maisie to Carol's. Maisie had known something was happening before he told her. She had appeared at breakfast already with her overnight bag half packed, which told him she had either overheard the call or simply predicted the outcome of leaving him alone with her drawing, both of which were plausible. She asked where he was going. He said New York. She said okay, in a voice that contained an enormous amount of information packed into 2 syllables. At Carol's front door, she turned around and looked at him. Take her drawing, Maisie said. I have it. Show it to her in person. Don't just talk. He looked at his daughter. When did you become an expert in this? I read a lot, Maisie said, as if this answered the question, which from her perspective it probably did. She hugged him hard around the middle, the top of her head at his sternum, and then she went inside without looking back, which was a thing she did when she had decided something was settled. He got in the truck. He had 1 bag behind the seat, the drawing in his jacket's inner pocket, and a rough idea of where he was going based on what he knew, which was that Montclair Group's headquarters were in Midtown Manhattan and that it would take him somewhere between 4 and 5 hours to get there depending on traffic, which on a Wednesday morning going into the city was going to be interesting. It took 4 hours and 40 minutes. He had been to New York twice before. Once as a teenager with his father to see a baseball game, once on leave from the Navy, passing through briefly on the way to somewhere else. He had no particular relationship with the city. He had always been better in places where the scale was human-sized, where you could see the horizon without a building in the way. He parked in a garage on 48th Street that cost more per hour than he'd have charged to replace an alternator, and walked the remaining 6 blocks to the address he'd found for Montclair Group's offices on his phone. The building was the kind of building that didn't announce itself. Sleek, tall, without the aggressive signage of corporations that needed people to know their name. The lobby had a desk made of something that looked like marble, or was marble, and a security guard who looked at Graham the way security guards in expensive lobbies looked at men in work jackets carrying nothing but their car keys. Graham Vossler, Graham said. I need to speak with Elara Montclair. The guard's expression did not change in any way that meant anything good. Do you have an appointment? No. Ms. Montclair's office requires, I know, tell her Graham Vossler is in the lobby. She'll know who I am. The guard looked at him for another moment, then picked up the desk phone with the polite efficiency of someone who expected this to resolve itself quickly in one direction. He spoke quietly into it. There was a pause. He listened. His expression changed fractionally, not dramatically, just a slight recalibration, the expression of someone whose expectation had been quietly corrected. Someone will be down, the guard said. Graham nodded. He found a space near the windows that wasn't in anyone's way and stood there and looked out at 47th Street and thought about nothing useful for about 4 minutes. The woman who came down was not Elara. She was mid-30s, professional, with the particular manner of someone who managed high-level access for a living and had done it long enough to be unimpressed by almost everything. She introduced herself as Dana, executive assistant. Ms. Montclair is in meetings until 6, she said. She's asked me to tell you that she... Dana paused fractionally, as if the message she'd been given was not quite what she'd been expecting to relay. She asked me to say that she's aware you're here and that she'll come down when she's finished. I'll wait, Graham said. Dana looked at him. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt, jeans without motor oil on them, and his father's old jacket, wool, navy blue, the kind of jacket that had cost something in 1975, and looked exactly like what it was. He had combed his hair, which he remembered at this moment with something close to gratitude toward Carol. There's a seating area, Dana said, and pointed toward a cluster of chairs near the far wall that had the look of furniture that was primarily decorative. That's fine, Graham said. Thank you. He sat. He waited. He was good at waiting. It was one of the things the Navy had done that stuck. The ability to go quiet inside and let time pass without fighting it. He watched the lobby, the flow of people in and out, the rhythms of the building's day. The desk guard who had moved past his initial assessment and now appeared to be pretending Graham wasn't there, which was fine. At 6:22, the elevator opened and Elara came out. She was in a different version of herself than the one he knew. The same person, clearly. Same walk, same way of reading a room in the first 2 seconds. But the context changed the texture of it. She had on a dark suit jacket and her hair was up, and she was carrying a phone in one hand and a folder in the other, and she looked like what she was, which was someone who had just spent 8 hours making decisions that affected large numbers of people and large amounts of money. She looked like the CEO of Montclair Group. She also looked tired, and when she saw him across the lobby, something moved through her face that she didn't have time to arrange before it arrived. She crossed the lobby. She stopped about 4 feet away. They looked at each other. Hi, Graham said. Hi, she said. How were your meetings? Long. A pause. You drove from Hadley Falls? Yeah. Today. This morning. She looked at him. He looked at her. The lobby moved around them. A few people leaving for the evening, someone at the desk on the phone, the general low hum of a building winding down. There's a place around the corner, she said. Coffee that isn't terrible. Can we walk? Yeah. They went out the revolving door onto the sidewalk. The February air was sharp, sharper than Hadley Falls, the buildings channeling the wind in ways that felt almost deliberate. They walked around the corner and into a small café that looked nothing like the Copper Finch, and everything like what New York produced when it was trying to make coffee approachable, which was something it had complicated feelings about. She ordered black coffee. He did the same. They sat at a table by the window. The street outside moved at New York speed, which was different from every other speed. You should have called, she said. I know. I would have... She stopped. I don't know what I would have done, actually. That's why I didn't call. She looked at her coffee cup. He reached into his jacket pocket and put the drawing on the table between them. She looked at it. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. He watched her face absorb the 3 figures and the single word above them, the uneven crayon letters, the careful, imprecise love of a child's best effort at a true thing. When she looked up, her eyes were different. Something in them that she was not going to let become anything in a cafe in Midtown Manhattan, but it was there. Maisie drew this, Graham said, after I asked you to leave. She drew it, and she put it on the kitchen table, and she told me that a Navy SEAL who could face dangerous men but couldn't face what he was actually afraid of wasn't being brave. Elara didn't say anything. She was right, he said. What I did, asking you to leave, I told myself it was about her. But she didn't need protecting from you. She was never afraid of you or of what you came with. I was. He stopped, because this part was harder, but he was going to say it completely because incomplete apologies were worse than no apology. I was afraid of losing someone again. I dressed it up as protection, and it wasn't. It was just fear. The cafe noise continued around them. Espresso machines, conversation, the scrape of a chair. You were also right that I should have told you who I was sooner, she said. Her voice was careful, balanced. I kept telling myself I was protecting something, that it was easier, cleaner, to be ordinary for a while. But I was hiding, and that wasn't fair to you. No, he said. It wasn't. I'm apologizing. I know, I'm accepting it. A pause. I'm also apologizing. She looked at him. I know, She stopped. I'm working on that. He almost smiled. She saw it and almost smiled back, and neither of them quite got there, but it was close. I need to know something, she said, not as an accusation, just, I need to know. When Tristan came to your garage and told you I was temporary, did you believe him? For about 4 hours, Graham said. She looked at him steadily. Then Maisie showed me the drawing, he said, and I stopped believing anything Tristan Vale told me about either of you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He's been moving quickly since I came back. There's a gala tonight. His company is co-hosting with ours. It was scheduled months ago. He's been telling people, she paused. He's been suggesting to board members and investors that we've reached an agreement about the merger, about the personal terms. Graham felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, something colder and more patient than anger. What does that mean practically? It means that tonight, in front of 200 people who matter to my company, he intends to announce an engagement. She said it flatly. To me, without having asked me. Because he's calculated that a public announcement is harder to walk back than a private one, and that my concerns about the company's reputation in front of investors will make me go along with it rather than make a scene. Graham looked at her. He's not wrong about how I've handled things in the past, she said. I've avoided confrontation with him because the company was always the hostage. If I pushed back too hard, he threatened to block the merger from his side, and the merger is good for a lot of people who aren't him or me. Where's the gala? She looked at him. Graham, where is it? It's at the Callaway, 12 blocks north. She held his gaze. You should understand what that room is going to be. 200 people, all of whom know Tristan, half of whom have done business with him for 20 years. You would walk in there as, I know what I'd walk in as. A mechanic from upstate New York in, she glanced at his jacket, a 30-year-old jacket. My father's jacket, he said. He wore it to every important thing he ever did. Elara looked at the jacket, at the man inside it. Something moved through her face. I'm not going to tell you not to come, she said. I'm not going to tell you what to do at all, but I need you to understand what you'd be walking into. I've walked into worse. This is different from, I know it's different. That's not the point. He leaned forward slightly. The point is that you've been managing this alone for months and you don't have to. And the point is that 200 of Tristan Vale's business contacts are considerably less frightening to me than what I drove 4 hours to avoid. She looked at him for a long time. What did you drive 4 hours to avoid? She asked quietly. Not saying this to your face, he said. I'm sorry. For asking you to leave. For not being honest about what I was afraid of. For letting you go without saying... He stopped, assembled the next part. For not saying that what happened between us isn't a chapter. It's not a temporary thing. I don't know how the logistics work. I don't know how your world and my world coexist practically. But I know that Maisie drew 3 people under one word, and she was not wrong about what she drew. Elara's hands were around her coffee cup, and she was not letting herself do whatever it was she was stopping herself from doing in this cafe with its reasonable coffee and its New York speed outside the window. Okay, she said. Okay, what? Okay, let me call Dana and see if she can get a guest badge sorted for tonight. She took out her phone. You'll need a tie. I don't have a tie. There's a place on 6th that won't charge you what it's worth. You have 40 minutes. He stood up. She stood up. They were both standing at the table, and she was closer than she'd been in 3 weeks. And the cafe was doing its cafe things around them, indifferent to what was happening between 2 people who had driven a long way and said difficult things and were still standing. She looked at him. Graham. Yeah. Don't walk in there like a rescue, she said. I don't need to be rescued. I've been doing this for 6 years and I know how to handle Tristan. I know. I need you to walk in there because you chose to be there, not for me. For... She stopped. For us, he said. She held his gaze. For us, she said. And the word in her mouth was the same word, but it sounded different when she said it. Fuller somehow, like she was testing the weight of it and finding it held. He bought a tie at the place on 6th. Navy blue, nothing complicated. The kind of tie that said he was making an effort without pretending to be something he wasn't. He changed in the men's room of a Starbucks on 52nd Street, which was not a dignified preparation for anything, but was the one available. He looked at himself in the mirror. The flannel shirt, his father's jacket, the new tie, and thought about the 200 people in that room and decided that if he started worrying about what he looked like, he was going to have to sit down somewhere and wait for the feeling to pass, which he didn't have time for. He texted Elara, "Ready." She replied, "Lobby, 7:30. She was there when he came through the Callaway's front doors, and she was wearing something he had not seen on her before. A dark dress, structured, with her hair up in a more formal version of itself. She looked like Elara Montclair, CEO, in a way that was complete and unambiguous and entirely her own. She also looked at him across the lobby with an expression that was completely Elara Winscott, the woman who had watched a door in a cafe on a cold October morning. Dana materialized and handed him a badge and said something about keeping phones on silent and then disappeared. Elara looked at his tie. "It works," she said. "It was $32. "It works," she said again. And there was something in her voice that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. They went in. The Callaway's main event space was the kind of room that had been designed to communicate power without making a fuss about it. High ceilings, long tables with white linens, lighting that was warm and deliberate. 200 people in clothes that cost more individually than Graham's truck, and the specific kind of noise that 200 people made when they were all performing a particular version of themselves for professional reasons. Every single person in the room registered Graham's arrival. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just a traveling current of attention, the slight adjustment of eyes in his direction, the fractional pause in conversations that moved through the room the way a stone moved through water. He was aware of it, and he let himself be aware of it without letting it matter. He had stood in worse rooms with worse things aimed at him, and he had learned a long time ago that the trick was not to pretend the awareness wasn't there, but to understand that awareness and danger were two very different things. Elara moved through the room the way she moved through everything, with the efficient purposefulness of someone who knew exactly where she was going. She introduced him to 3 people whose names he immediately didn't retain and whose titles were impressive enough that he could see them adjusting what they thought about the man in the navy jacket beside her. He shook hands. He was polite. He did not explain himself. Tristan found them at 8:20. He came across the room with a drink in hand and a smile that had been constructed from the parts of smiles without being assembled in the right order. He looked at Elara first, then at Graham, and the smile stayed on his face because men like Tristan Vale had the kind of facial control that kept smiles in place past the point where the interior was no longer smiling. "Vossler," he said, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I'm full of surprises," Graham said. Tristan looked at Elara. "I'd hoped we could speak before the announcement. There are some board members. There's not going to be an announcement," Elara said. Tristan's smile adjusted slightly. Not faded, adjusted. "Elara, we've been over the terms. The Harlan Group alone represents 40% of—" "Tristan," her voice was level and specific. "I'm not going to marry you. That was true in October when I left, and it's true now. Whatever you've told people here tonight, you'll need to tell them something else." Around them, the near vicinity of the room had gone very slightly quieter, the way rooms did when something worth listening to was happening near enough to hear. Tristan looked at Graham, at the jacket, at the $32 tie. The calculation behind his eyes was visible if you knew what to look for. "You drove up from wherever to do this," he said to Graham. His voice was still even. "I have to respect that at least." "You don't have to respect anything," Graham said. "You just have to hear what she said. What she said is a business decision with consequences she may not have fully—" "It's not a business decision," Elara said. "It's a personal one, and I've made it." Tristan set his drink down on a passing waiter's tray. He looked at Elara with the expression of a man revising a long-held assumption in real time, which was not a comfortable thing for him and showed in the corners of his face even with all his control. 6 years, he said. "I've been patient." "You've been persistent," she said. "That's different." "You're throwing away—" "I'm not throwing away anything." Her voice didn't rise. It went, if anything, more precise. "The merger can proceed on its business merits or not proceed at all. That's always been my position. What I won't do is make a personal decision to secure a professional outcome, and I will not stand in front of these people and let you announce something I never agreed to." A pause. "We can talk about the Harlan terms next week through our respective legal teams, the same way we should have been talking about them for 2 years. Tristan was quiet for a long moment. I was looking at her with something complicated moving through his face. Not just anger, not just calculation, something that might have been, buried underneath the business, the closest thing to disappointment that a man like Tristan Vale was capable of. Graham recognized it. He almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "This isn't how I expected tonight to go," Tristan said. "I know," Elara said. "I'm sorry for that part." Something shifted. Very slightly. Tristan looked at Graham once more, not with hostility exactly, more with the look of someone who had made an assessment and found they'd undervalued the variable. Then he picked up his drink from the next passing tray, a different drink than the one he'd put down, and walked away into the crowd. The near vicinity of the room released something it had been holding. Conversations resumed. A woman near the bar turned back to the man she'd been talking to. The particular event space hum rebuilt itself. Elara stood very still. "You okay?" Graham said quietly. "Ask me in 10 minutes, she said. He stood beside her. He didn't say anything else. He was present in the way he'd learned to be present, completely, without distraction. And she was beside him in the particular silence of someone who had just done something that cost them and was still feeling the full weight of the cost. After a moment, she turned to look at him. Her face in the deliberate lighting of the Callaway was the face he knew. All of it. Not just the CEO version. Not just the woman in the garage, both of them. The whole complicated person who ran a $9 billion company and argued about horses with an 8-year-old and watched the door and cafe booths and dried dishes without being asked. "You didn't rescue me," she said. "No," he agreed. "I did that." "You did." She looked at him for a long moment. "I'm going to need to go talk to about 6 people in this room right now, because the absence of an announcement is going to generate questions, and I'd rather answer them on my terms." "Okay," he said. "Will you stay?" He looked around the room. 200 people he didn't know in clothes he couldn't afford for an occasion that was several layers removed from anything he'd been prepared for tonight. He thought about what this room was, and what he was in it, and how none of that had any bearing on the question she'd just asked. "Yeah," he said, "I'll stay." She went. He watched her cross the room with the specific walk she had, the one that understood where it was going, and he watched her reach the first of the 6 people she needed to talk to, and he watched them receive her with the particular mix of uncertainty and deference that meant she was the most important person in that cluster, which she was. He found a spot near the edge of the room, back to the wall, old habit, and stood with a glass of water he'd picked up from a passing tray and watched the room do what it did. A man came and stood near him after a while. Late 60s, comfortable in the room, the way people were comfortable in rooms they'd been in many versions of. He looked at Graham with the frank, interested appraisal of someone who had decided life was too short for subtlety. "You're with Elara," the man said. Not a question. "Yes. I'm Walter Chun. I've been on the Montclair board for 11 years. He said it not as a credential, but as a way of explaining his interest. I've been waiting 6 years for Elara to stop letting Tristan Vale complicate her life." Graham looked at him. "I'm Graham Vossler. I know who you are." Walter looked at him with steady, unsentimental eyes. "Hadley Falls, former Navy. You stepped in front of Tristan in a café in October, and she apparently drove back there every week for 3 months. She told you that." "She didn't have to. I've known Elara since she was 24. Walter sipped his drink. "She doesn't look at people the way she looks at you." Graham didn't answer that. "I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable," Walter said. "I'm just telling you what someone who's been watching can see." He paused. "Tristan looks at her like she's a position on a spreadsheet. You look at her like she's a person. She is a person. Remarkably so. Some people in this room have forgotten that." Walter finished his drink and set it aside. "She's also brilliant and relentless, and occasionally impossible to reason with, and constitutionally incapable of admitting when she's exhausted." A pause. "She'll need someone who doesn't need her to be easy." "I have an 8-year-old daughter," Graham said. "Easy is not my primary requirement." Walter looked at him. Then he laughed. A real one, short and genuine. "Good," he said. "That's the right answer." He shook Graham's hand with the firm grip of a man who had shaken many hands over many decades and knew which ones were worth remembering. "Have a better evening than this room deserves, Vossler." He moved away into the crowd. Graham stood at his spot by the wall and waited. Elara came back to him at 9:40. She had talked to her 6 people, and from the look on her face, the conversations had gone the way they needed to go, which was not easily, which was the way difficult conversations usually went when they went correctly. "Ready to get out of here?" she said. 20 minutes ago, he said. Something that was finally a real smile crossed her face. Not the precursor to one. The actual thing. She found his hand with hers, briefly, in the particular way of someone who didn't usually reach for people and was doing it anyway, and then she let go. They went out through the lobby, past the doorman who held the door with a practiced neutrality that revealed nothing, and into the February night on the sidewalk outside the Callaway Hotel, with the city doing all the things the city did in the dark, which was everything, constantly, at every volume simultaneously. She stopped on the sidewalk. She tilted her head back slightly and looked at what could be seen of the sky above the buildings, which was not much. Not like Hadley Falls, where the sky was a full thing. "I have a board meeting tomorrow at 9, she said. "I know. I have 3 calls before that." "Okay. I can't just—" She stopped. "I mean, I can't pack a bag and drive back with you tomorrow and pretend none of this exists." "I know," he said. "I didn't come here to ask you to." She looked at him. "What did you come here to ask?" "I came to say I was wrong, and I was sorry," he said. "And to give you the drawing in person, and to make sure you knew that when you're ready to figure out the rest of it, I'll be there. The rest of it is complicated. Yeah. The distance alone. Yeah. And the company, I know. And Maisie drew the picture," he said. "She's already figured out her position on it." Elara looked at him. The city noise went on around them. A cab went past. Somewhere up the block, 2 people were laughing about something. "I need time," she said, "to figure out how to restructure some things. There are people I need to talk to and board considerations, and I can't just—" "Elara." He said her name the specific way he'd learned to say it, the way that meant he was paying complete attention. "I'm not in a hurry. I have a garage and a daughter and a terrible coffee machine. I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression he had first seen in the Copperfinch Café on a cold October morning, the one that was trying to locate him in a category and couldn't manage it. Then the expression changed into something he didn't have a name for yet, something that belonged to the person rather than the calculation, and she looked away for a moment at the city going on all around them with its indifferent energy. "I need to call Maisie," she said. Graham reached into his pocket and handed her his phone, already unlocked. She looked at the phone in her hand, looked at him. Then she found Maisie's contact. She had been in Maisie's contact list for months, and pressed call. It rang twice. Then his daughter's voice, immediately awake and fully present in the way she always was when something important was happening. "Dad?" "It's Elara," she said. A pause. A very short pause. "Did you get my drawing?" Maisie said. Elara's voice, when it came back, was not the CEO voice, or the careful, controlled voice, or the one she used in lobbies and boardrooms. It was smaller than that. It was the voice of someone who had been in an enormous room full of people all evening and had only just encountered something real. "I got it," she said. "I got it, Maisie." "Are you coming home?" Maisie said. Elara closed her eyes. One breath. "Yes," she said. She said yes on a sidewalk in February with a borrowed phone in her hand and the city making its noise around her, and that yes was the beginning of a very long and imperfect process that neither of them had a map for. Graham drove back to Hadley Falls the next morning. Alone, the way he'd come, with the heater doing its insufficient best against the February cold, and the radio on a station that faded in and out through the Catskills before resolving into something steady on the other side. He stopped once for gas and a coffee that was not terrible by his standards, which meant it was probably terrible by most people's, and he sat in the truck at the gas station for about 10 minutes doing nothing in particular before getting back on Route 9 North. He thought about what came next, because what came next was not obvious, and was not going to be easy, and he had been honest about that to himself since before he drove down. The yes on the sidewalk was real. He didn't doubt that. But real things still required construction, and construction required materials and tools and time and the willingness to make mistakes in the process and fix them without abandoning the project. He picked up Maisie from Carol's that afternoon. Carol met him at the door with the expression of someone who wanted very much to ask several specific questions and had decided, for now, to ask none of them. She handed him a container of leftover soup instead. "She's in the backyard with the dog," Carol said. "You don't have a dog." "Neighbor's dog came through the fence. Maisie's been calling it Sergeant for 3 hours." He went through the house and out the back door. Maisie was sitting in the cold grass with a medium-sized brown dog of unclear heritage who appeared to have accepted her completely. She looked up when she heard the door. "Is it fixed?" she said. "It's a start," he said. She absorbed this, looked back at the dog. Did she like the drawing? She cried a little. Maisie nodded slowly, with the expression of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. "I knew she would." She looked back at him. "Is she coming back?" "She's coming. It'll take some time." "How much time?" "I don't know exactly." Maisie considered this with the same seriousness she applied to most things. The dog put its head in her lap. "That's okay," she said. "Good things take time. You told me that." He had told her that. He had told her that about the oak tree they'd planted in the backyard 3 years ago that was still looking unconvinced about the whole enterprise. "Yeah," he said. "I did." She got up, brushed the grass off her jeans, picked up her backpack. At the door she stopped and turned around one more time. "Dad?" "What?" "You combed your hair." He looked at her. "Aunt Carol told me she said that," Maisie said, without expression, and went inside. The weeks that followed were not a montage. They were not the clean forward motion of things resolving into place. They were the specific, unglamorous work of 2 people and 1 child in 3 different configurations of the same problem, trying to figure out the shape of something that had no precedent either of them could refer to. Elara called every evening. Not always for long, sometimes it was 15 minutes, sometimes it was an hour, sometimes it was 5 minutes because she was between things and just needed to hear a voice that wasn't about the quarterly numbers. She called at different times depending on what the day had required of her, and Graham learned her schedule the way he'd learned the sounds of the garage. What 7:30 meant versus 9. What the particular pace of her voice told him about what kind of day it had been. Maisie took the phone sometimes. She and Elara had conversations that Graham was not entirely privy to, which he took as a good sign. He'd catch fragments. Maisie reporting on Devlin, who had settled into a relatively stable phase of only moderate chaos. Maisie asking Elara about New York, whether the coffee was actually better there, whether there were good trees. Elara asking Maisie about the book with the dog, whether they'd gotten back together, which Maisie confirmed they had, with the particular satisfaction of someone who had been proven right about covers. Elara came up on a Friday night in early March. Not in the gray sedan this time. She'd taken a car service, which she mentioned in a way that told him she was still negotiating the line between her world and his, still finding where the edges were. She arrived at 8, Maisie was supposed to be in bed, and wasn't, and when the headlights came up the driveway, Maisie was at the window before Graham could get to the door. He heard her go down the porch steps. He heard Elara get out of the car. Then silence. Not empty silence, the kind that had something in it. And when he got to the doorway, Maisie had her arms around Elara's waist, with the full committed embrace of a child who had decided something was hers, and Elara had both arms around Maisie's back and her face against the top of her head, and neither of them was saying anything. Graham stood in the doorway. He had a daughter who felt things with her whole body. He had known that since she was 2. He had watched her grieve her mother with her whole body, and he had watched her rebuild with her whole body, and he was watching her now with her whole body receive someone back who had been absent, and the watching of it was the kind of thing that sat in a particular place in his chest and did not move. He went back inside. He made tea, which he didn't particularly want because he needed something to do with his hands. They came in a few minutes later, Maisie's hand in Elara's, Maisie already talking about something with the energy of someone who had been storing material for weeks. "You have to meet Sergeant," Maisie said. "Who's Sergeant?" "The neighbor's dog. He comes through the fence. He's not our dog officially, but he thinks he is. Dad said we can't keep calling him that or we'll get attached." She looked at Graham. "We're already attached." "We're not keeping someone else's dog," Graham said. "I'm just saying we're attached." Elara looked at Graham over the top of Maisie's head. Her expression had the thing in it he'd seen on the sidewalk in New York. Not the boardroom version, not the careful version, the real one. She looked like someone who had come home, and the strange thing, the thing he noticed in his chest, was that she also looked like she knew it. She stayed for the weekend. She slept in the guest room, which he had cleaned with more attention than usual, while telling himself it was just standard hospitality. Saturday was ordinary in the specific way that good days were ordinary. Breakfast, the garage, because he had one car due in that morning, and she sat on the stool by the parts cabinet, like she'd never stopped sitting there. Lunch at the kitchen table with the wobbly leg. An afternoon walk by the river where Maisie ran ahead and reported on everything. There were also hard conversations because there had to be, because they'd agreed without discussing it that they were not going to skip the hard parts. They had the first one Saturday evening after Maisie went to bed. Graham made coffee, his terrible coffee, and she drank it, which he understood as a choice she was making, and they sat at the kitchen table and talked about the practical reality of what yes actually meant. "I'm not moving to Hadley Falls full-time," she said. It was not a cruel statement. It was the honest one, said directly, which was the only way she knew how to say difficult things. "Not right now. I could do more remote, and I want to, but the company needs a physical presence from me. There are things I can only do in person." "I know," he said. "That means a lot of this is going to be distance." "I know." "And Maisie is 8, he said. "She's adaptable. She'll miss you when you're not here. So will I. That's going to be true, and we're going to live with it." Elara looked at her coffee cup. "I've been thinking about restructuring my role," she said. "Not stepping away. I'm not interested in that, and I think you know that about me." "I do. But there's a version where I designate a COO with real operational authority, and I become more of a strategic presence. It's actually better for the company. I've been holding too much myself for too long, and that's not sustainable." She looked up. "It would give me significantly more flexibility about where I am." "Is that a business decision or a personal one?" "Both," she said. "They don't have to be in opposition." He thought about what she'd said months ago in the garage, that the Montclair group functioned about the same, whether she was in the Manhattan office or a rental in Hadley Falls, which said something about the difference between being needed and being present. He thought about a woman who had been running a $9 billion company at full capacity from a small-town short-term rental while arguing about horses with his daughter and drying his dishes without being asked. "Okay," he said. "There are board implications. I need 3 to 4 months to get it right." "Okay." "You keep saying okay." "Because I mean it," he said. "I'm not going to pretend the distance isn't going to be hard. It is going to be hard. But I'm not going to tell you how to run your company either. You know what you're doing." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're remarkably uncomplicated about this." "I'm not uncomplicated. I'm just clear about what I want." "What do you want?" "You," he said. "Maisie's drawing. Whatever shape that takes when we actually build it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want that too." Pause. "I also want you to tell me when it's hard, not just absorb it and say okay. That's not... I need you to actually say when it's difficult." "I will," he said. "Will you?" He considered that honestly. "Probably not immediately, but I'll get there." She nodded slowly. "I'll take that. It's what I can offer right now." "I know." A pause. "It's more than most people offer." They sat with their terrible coffee in the kitchen with the overhead light doing what it did, which was illuminate everything, and the house was quiet around them with Maisie asleep upstairs, and it was not romantic in any cinematic sense of the word. It was just 2 imperfect people at a table trying to be honest with each other about something that mattered, and that was harder than most things and worth more than most things, and both of them knew it. She drove back Sunday evening. Maisie stood on the porch and watched the car go, and Graham stood beside her, and Maisie put her hand in his without looking at him. "She's coming back," Maisie said. "Yeah." "Not just visiting, actually coming back." "Yeah." Maisie nodded, satisfied. "Okay." She went inside. He stood on the porch for another minute in the cold March air, and then he went inside too. The months that followed had the texture of real things, which is to say they were uneven and occasionally frustrating and interrupted by circumstances neither of them controlled. The restructuring Elara was navigating at Montclair took longer than 3 months, because board dynamics never moved at the speed that logic suggested they should. And there were 2 members who resisted the COO appointment for reasons that were professional on the surface and territorial underneath. She called him one Wednesday night at 11, which meant it had been a bad day, and she talked for 40 minutes about a board member named Hargrove, who had the vision of a man standing inside a box attempting to describe the landscape. And Graham listened and said what was useful and didn't say what wasn't. And she said at the end, "You're the only person I can say that to without it ending up in a meeting as someone's leverage." "Hargrove doesn't know my number," Graham said. She laughed. He had come to love the sound of her laugh on the phone specifically. There was a quality to it when she wasn't in person, unguarded in a different way, like it caught her the same way it did in the cafe that first morning. The Harlan merger was ultimately restructured. The terms Elara's legal team presented removed the personal conditions that had never been formally written, but had always been Tristan's actual intent, and the business case without those conditions was sound enough that the board approved it. Tristan signed because the alternative was watching the deal collapse entirely and losing the gains he'd spent years building toward. He signed, and he did not call, and Elara told Graham about it in a text. "It's done," that he read in the garage on a Thursday morning and sat with for a moment before replying, "Good." He never heard Tristan Vale's name again in a context that mattered. Elara was named, in April, by a business publication he'd never read, to some kind of annual list of executives under 40 that apparently meant something in her world. He found out when Maisie saw it on a tablet at Carol's house and announced it at dinner with the satisfaction of someone sharing good news about a family member. "She's famous," Maisie said. "She was already famous," Graham said. "More famous now." "Does that change anything?" Maisie considered this seriously. "No," she concluded. "She still thinks the coffee machine is bad. Everyone thinks the coffee machine is bad. You think it's fine. I think it makes coffee." "That's a very low bar, Dad." He drove down to New York twice more that spring, both times planned, once bringing Maisie. The three of them walked through Central Park on a Saturday, which was not the quietest environment in the world, but had its own particular life. And Maisie was interested in everything, and Elara knew things about the park's history that she delivered in the same casual conversational way she delivered most information. And they ate lunch at a place where the sandwiches were good, and the price was something Graham declined to look at too closely. And Maisie fell asleep in the back of the cab on the way back to Elara's apartment, which was on the Upper East Side and was exactly what he'd expected, and nothing he'd expected simultaneously. He stood in her kitchen that evening, which was the kitchen of someone who had professional cooking equipment and almost no food in the refrigerator, and she stood beside him, and they were quiet in the particular way they'd gotten good at, the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill space. "It's very clean," he said. "I'm not here much." "It doesn't look like you," he said. He meant it as observation, not criticism. She looked around the kitchen. "I know." A pause. "It's a functional space where I sleep when I'm working. Where do you feel like yourself?" She didn't answer immediately. He looked at her profile, the overhead light doing its kitchen light thing, same as his but different. "Hadley Falls," she said. Quiet. Like she was confirming something she'd already known. He nodded. "That's not a small thing to say," she added. "I know it isn't. I'm not trying to—" She stopped. "I'm not going to tell you it means I'll be there every week. It doesn't change the board meeting on Monday or the Harlan integration or the fact that I have 22 people who report directly to me. I know. I just want you to know that I—" She turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that was unarmored in the way she rarely allowed herself to be in functional spaces, in offices, in rooms designed for productivity. "That place is home to me, the garage and the kitchen table and the river and the school plays and the terrible coffee. That's where I'm myself." She held his gaze. "You made that. You and Maisie. You made a place feel like home to someone who'd forgotten what that felt like." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You did that. We just didn't lock the door." She pressed her lips together in the way that meant she was not going to let herself cry in her own kitchen about something that was also a happy thing, which he respected. "We should check on Maisie," she said. "She was asleep 3 minutes after the cab started moving. She's fine." "I know she's fine. I just need something to do with this moment." He understood that. He reached over and took her hand, which she allowed, which still felt like something deliberate when she did it, a conscious choosing. "Elara," he said. "Graham," she said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. "The COO appointment is official in June," she said finally. "I'll have real flexibility after that. I've been thinking about something." "What?" "Splitting my time, formally. An office here for when I need to be in the city, and Hadley Falls as my primary residence. She said it matter-of-factly, the way she said most things that were actually enormous, like the enormity of something didn't change how you approached it, just how much care you applied. There are things I need to be present for physically in New York, but most of what I actually need to do can happen from anywhere. Have you run those numbers? He said. Not mockingly. He genuinely wanted to know if she'd thought it through. Extensively, she said. I build models for a living. What does the model say? That it works? With some adjustment periods and some months that are worse than others, and some board quarters where I'll need to be in the city more than I'd like. She looked at him. It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect. I know, but it's... She paused. Possible. It's actually possible. He thought about a garage in a small town and a kitchen table with a wobbly leg and a daughter who drew crayon pictures of the truth. He thought about what possible meant when you were honest about it. Not easy, not certain, not free from difficulty, just genuinely within reach if you chose to extend your hand toward it. Okay, he said. You keep saying that. It keeps being what I mean. She looked at him with the expression that he still couldn't put a category on, that existed in the space between known things. Then she leaned against him very slightly, not dramatically, just a degree of lean, and he put his arm around her and they stood in her functional kitchen that didn't look like her and waited for the moment to finish being what it was. They got married in September. Not in New York, not in a hotel ballroom with 200 people in expensive clothes. In the backyard of Graham's house in Hadley Falls, on a Saturday afternoon when the weather was the kind that late summer produced if it was feeling generous. Warm enough without being hot, a breeze off the ridge that moved the leaves without making a fuss about it. There were about 30 people. Carol and Pete and their kids. Walter Chun, who had driven up from the city and appeared at the backyard gate with a bottle of wine that was certainly far better than anything else that would be served that afternoon, and handed it to Carol with the no-nonsense warmth of someone who had decided he liked this family. A handful of people from Hadley Falls who had known Graham long enough to matter. Two of Elara's people from Montclair, colleagues who had become something closer than colleagues over years, who arrived looking slightly uncertain about the logistics of a backyard wedding in upstate New York, and left looking like they understood something they hadn't before. Maisie was the one who insisted on the flowers. She had found out, from some source she refused to disclose, that September weddings were supposed to have dahlias, and she had conveyed this information to Elara with the certainty of someone who had done her research and was not interested in discussing alternatives. Elara had agreed without argument. Graham had been informed of this decision after it was made. You were consulted, Maisie told him when he pointed this out. I was told. That's a form of consultation. He looked at her. She looked back at him with the perfect serenity she deployed when she believed herself to be entirely right, which was most of the time, and was actually true approximately as often as it felt. The ceremony was short, not because they hadn't thought about it, but because they'd thought about it and concluded that the part that mattered was the part where you stood in front of the people who knew you and said the true thing out loud. Everything else was decoration. Graham wore his father's jacket. He'd had it cleaned, which was the only concession to occasion he was willing to make, and it looked exactly like what it was. An old jacket that had been worn to important things, which made it appropriate. Elara wore a dress the color of the sky at that particular hour, which was somewhere between blue and gray, and she walked across the backyard from the house without ceremony, without music, just walked toward him the way she walked everywhere, like she knew where she was going. Maisie stood between them. This had also been Maisie's decision, disclosed to Graham approximately 4 days before the wedding as a settled matter. She was going to stand between them. She had a drawing to give to Elara at the end, a new one, a better one, because she had been practicing, and the original, while accurate, had been executed at the artistic level of a person who was 8 and was now 9 and had improved. The woman who performed the ceremony was a justice of the peace from 2 towns over who had been doing this for 31 years and had the compact, efficient manner of someone who understood that the ceremony was not the marriage. It was just the door to it. She said the important words. They said theirs. The words were not original. They were the old ones, the ones that had been worn smooth by so many uses over so many years that they fit like something that had always been there. Graham said them looking at Elara's face in the September afternoon light, and he meant every syllable specifically, without poetry, without performance. Just the true intention of a man who had driven 4 hours to say I was wrong and stayed long enough to mean I'm in. Elara said them looking at him the way she'd looked at him across the Callaway lobby. Seeing him, specifically and completely, the person and not the category. The mechanic and the former SEAL and the single father and the man who stood up in a cafe when no one else was going to and chose him with the deliberate conscious choosing that she brought to everything she actually wanted. Maisie presented the drawing when the justice of the peace indicated it was time. It was better than the first one. Technically, noticeably. The proportions were more accurate. The faces had expressions now. There were details. The garage in the background, the river visible at the edge, what appeared to be a medium-sized brown dog of unclear heritage who was recognizably Sergeant. 3 figures in the center. The word above them. Family. Elara took the drawing and looked at it for a long time. "This one's better," she said. "I told you I'd been practicing," Maisie said. "The dog is a good addition. He's basically ours." "He goes home every night," Graham said. "He comes back every morning," Maisie said. Elara looked at Graham over the top of the drawing with an expression that contained about 7 different things at once, and he looked back at her with an expression that probably contained the same, and Maisie looked at both of them with the expression of someone who had understood how this was going to go significantly earlier than either adult and was prepared to be patient while they caught up. Carol was crying in the way she did things, efficiently and without drama. Pete put his arm around her. Walter Choon applauded once, decisively, and then stopped because no one else had started yet, and he looked entirely unembarrassed about it. The afternoon stretched long the way September afternoons did, the light going gold and then amber, the backyard full of conversation, and Carol's food, which was excellent in the chaotic, abundant way of someone who cooked with more enthusiasm than precision. Maisie ran with her cousins until they were all red-faced and grass-stained. Elara sat at the table in the backyard with Walter Choon and 2 of her Montclair colleagues, and Graham watched from across the yard as she talked with her hands, animated, the CEO fully present, the woman from the café fully present, both of them simultaneously, the same person. He thought about what it had cost to get here. Not sentimentally, practically, concretely. The fear that had dressed itself as protection. The phone call where he'd asked her to leave and hadn't been honest about why. The 3 weeks of a house that sounded wrong and a daughter who had stopped asking him to sit with her at bedtime. The drive to New York in February with a 30-year-old jacket and a crayon drawing and an apology that he'd had to assemble piece by piece because the true version was more complicated and more embarrassing than the easy version. He thought about what his daughter had told him at the kitchen table, quietly and precisely. A Navy SEAL who can face dangerous men but runs from someone he loves isn't being brave. He had been afraid. He had been afraid in the specific way of someone who had already survived the worst kind of loss and understood viscerally that it was survivable, which made it no less terrifying. The loss didn't break you. The anticipation of losing again, that was the thing that made men smaller than they'd otherwise be. He had been smaller than himself for 3 weeks in January and February, and his 8-year-old daughter had been the one to correct his trajectory, which was humbling in a way he would carry with him for the rest of his life. He was not small now. He was standing in his backyard in his father's jacket, watching his wife talk with her hands and his daughter chase her cousins in the grass. And nothing about the picture was perfect. The grass needed cutting. The yard had a fence post that had been leaning since July. Carol's casserole dish had cracked somehow, and no one was sure when. Maisie had grass stains on a dress she'd been explicitly asked to be careful about. But all of it was real in the specific, irreplaceable way of real things, which was that it was theirs. The last guest left at 9. Carol hugged Graham at the gate for a long time without saying anything, which was its own kind of eloquence. Walter Choon shook his hand and told him he'd made a good decision, which was how Walter expressed warmth, and Graham told him he'd made 2 or 3 bad ones first, which was honest, and Walter said that was usually how it worked. Maisie fell asleep on the couch at 9:30, still in the grass-stained dress, her new drawing propped against the cushion beside her, the brown dog sergeant apparently having entered through the back door at some point during the evening and settled at her feet, which no one had noticed until everyone else was gone. Graham looked at the dog. "He's going home tomorrow," he said. Elara looked at the dog, then at Maisie, then at him. "Probably not tomorrow," she said. He looked at her. "She named him," Elara said. She named someone else's dog. He doesn't seem to remember that. Graham looked at the dog, who looked back at him with the unconcerned confidence of an animal that had already made its decision about where it lived. He looked at Maisie asleep on the couch with her drawing beside her. He looked at Elara in her September sky dress, the evening making her face the particular version of itself it made after long days. Less constructed, fully present, her. "Fine," he said. "That was fast." "Don't push it." She smiled. The real one. The one that still caught her slightly off guard sometimes. That was still more like something her face decided than something she chose. And he had decided some time ago that this was one of his favorite things in the world. This particular evidence of something unguarded. They cleaned up the backyard together in the quiet that was left when the day finished with itself, carrying things in, stacking dishes, folding the table Carol had brought from her house. It was domestic and slow and lit by the kitchen light coming through the screen door and the string lights he'd strung along the fence that he'd bought impulsively at the hardware store and now was glad of. Inside, they carried Maisie to her room. Between them, one on each side, careful. She stirred but didn't wake, muttered something that contained the word sergeant. They laid her down. Graham pulled the blanket up. Elara set the drawing on the nightstand. They stood in the doorway for a moment the way you stood when you'd done the last thing that needed doing. "She's going to be impossible about the dog," Graham said, very quietly. "She already is," Elara said. "This was your fault." "I said probably not tomorrow. That's a complete sentence." He looked at her in the hallway light. She looked at him. Sergeant had followed them upstairs and was sitting between them, looking at neither of them with the lofty self-possession of an animal that considered itself settled. Graham would think about this moment later, would return to it in the way you return to things that had weight. Not the ceremony, not the backyard full of people, not the drive to New York or the Callaway Hotel or the sidewalk in February, but this, the hallway, the dog, the sound of Maisie breathing steadily in the room behind them. Elara in a dress the color of the September sky, looking at him the way she looked at him. He had spent years building a small life to keep the world out. Not with bad intentions, with the best ones, with the fierce, uncomplicated intention of a man trying to protect his daughter from any more loss. But the walls he'd built to keep the dangerous things out had also kept the good things out, and the two were not as distinguishable as he'd told himself because the door that let in grief also let in love, and you could not have one without the other, and building walls against the grief meant building them against the love too. And he had been doing that, quietly and convincingly, for 4 years, until a woman watched a cafe door with her hand flat on a table and something in him recognized it and crossed 12 feet of scuffed linoleum without thinking. He had not been brave in the cafe. He'd been instinctive. The bravery had come later, smaller and harder and less cinematic, sitting at the kitchen table accepting that he'd been wrong, driving 4 hours to say it out loud, standing in a hallway in February, understanding that the most frightening thing he'd ever done was not the work he'd done in uniform, but the work of choosing to love someone and meaning it and staying. Every person he loved was a door he was choosing to leave open. That was the thing. It was not protection that made a life. It was the decision, over and over, to remain open to what could come through. The loss and the ordinary Tuesdays, and the horse arguments, and the terrible coffee, and the drawings on kitchen tables, and the dogs that didn't go home. Maisie had understood this before he did. She had always been wiser than him about the things that mattered, and he had stopped being surprised by this and started being grateful for it instead. The next morning was Sunday. Graham made breakfast, the actual kind. Eggs, toast, the one thing he could reliably produce before 8 in the morning. Maisie came down in pajamas with her hair wrecked from sleep, stood in the kitchen doorway, and said, "Is Elara here? Here?" "Yes," Graham said. "Good." She sat down. The dog sat beside her. "Are we keeping the dog?" "We're discussing it." "That means yes," Maisie said. Elara came downstairs a few minutes later in the slightly wrong era quality of someone who had stayed in a place long enough for it to start feeling familiar, but not yet fully their own. She sat down at the table. Graham put coffee in front of her, his terrible coffee. She wrapped both hands around it. "You could get a better machine," she said. "I know. I could buy you a better machine. I know. You won't let me." "The machine is fine. She looked at him over the rim of the mug with the expression that contained everything, the boardroom and the garage and the river and the backyard, and shook her head very slightly, affectionately, at a man who was what he was and had no particular intention of being otherwise. "Fine," she said. Maisie looked between them. "Can I have eggs?" "Already made," Graham said. "With the cheese?" Obviously. She accepted this with the satisfaction of someone whose household has its reliable things. Outside, the September morning was doing what September mornings did in Hadley Falls. Cool air, high sky, the kind of light that came in low and found the color in everything it touched. The oak tree in the backyard had grown, grudgingly, another few inches toward the thing it was eventually going to be. The three of them sat at the kitchen table with the wobbly leg, which Graham had still not fixed, and at this point had accepted as a permanent feature of the table, of the kitchen, of the life assembled inside this house. The dog sat beside Maisie with the patient permanence of a creature that had long since settled the question of where it belonged. Elara would drive to New York on Tuesday. There was a board meeting on Wednesday and a Harlan integration meeting Thursday, and she'd be back Friday evening, and that was the shape of things. The driving, the distance, the calls at 11 when the day had been long, the weekends that were fully theirs, the slow building of a life that was large enough for two incompatible worlds to share without either of them having to become something they weren't. It was not simple. It was not going to become simple. But it was real, and it was theirs, and it had been built from honest materials, the apologies that had cost something, the fear acknowledged rather than disguised, the crayon drawings that told the truth before the people who made them were ready to. Graham looked at his daughter eating eggs across the table. He looked at his wife with her hands around a bad cup of coffee, and the morning light finding the side of her face. He thought about what it meant to survive things, really survive them, not just outlast them. And he thought that survival was maybe not the right word. The right word was something more active than that. Choosing was the right word. Choosing to stay, every day, in the life you'd built, rather than the life that hadn't hurt you yet. He had spent years being very good at the wrong kind of courage. He was learning a different kind now, the kind that didn't require a threat to activate, the kind that got up in the morning and made eggs with the cheese and fixed what was fixable and left the wobbly table leg. Because some things you just learned to accommodate, and sat at breakfast with his family on a Sunday morning in September and understood, without drama, without ceremony, that this was the thing he'd been afraid of losing. Not because he was guaranteed to keep it, because nothing was guaranteed and he was choosing it anyway. That was the only kind of courage that had ever actually mattered. And outside, the September light moved across the yard the way it did when it was unrushed, finding the grass, the fence post still leaning, the oak tree putting its slow effort toward the sky, the whole ordinary, irreplaceable morning doing nothing but continuing to be itself, which was, in the end, exactly enough.